Morning, everybody, and welcome to Hearing 25, Future Urban and Residential Medium Density Zone Hearings. Almost everybody in the room, I think, is familiar with this process that we're going through, but I think there might be one or two that aren't. So I'll briefly introduce the panel, or ask the panel to introduce themselves. Then I'll just spend a couple of minutes explaining the process for these Zoom hearings, just so that people are aware of that. But we'll do the introductions first. My name's Phil Mitchell. I'm chairing these hearings. I'm an independent commissioner from Auckland. And if the rest of the panel could introduce themselves, please, then the council team, and then any submitters that are currently in the room, that would be great. Thanks.
Jan Sedgwick. I'm a Waikato District Councillor and appointed as an independent commissioner.
Good morning, I'm Diane Swalton. I'm an independent commissioner, but a former Waikato District Councillor.
Yes, good morning, Janet Gibb here. I'm a current councillor at Waikato District Council and an independent commissioner.
Morena koutou, Linda Te Aho, Independent Hearings Commissioner.
Morena koutou, Will Mark, Independent Commissioner.
Morena, Paul Cooney, Independent Commissioner, Deputy Chair and Lawyer.
Thank you. So that's us. If we could just have the staff team, please, and then move to the submitters.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Jonathan Cleese, consultant planner, but assisting Waikato Council, and did the 42A report on this topic.
Good morning, Mr. Cleese.
Morning, all. Fletcher Bell here. I'm District Land Administrator and Hearings Coordinator for the District Council. Thanks.
Morning, Sandra Kelly, Senior Project Coordinator and RM Policy Team Leader.
Morena koutou, I'm Carolyn Redd, Assistant Council.
That would appear to be the council team.
Good morning, sir. Can you hear us?
We can, Mr. Allen.
Very
good morning.
We have the Taingaora team sitting around the room in Alice Gould.
Very good. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm also here for Tainui Holdings. It's a very short presentation right at the end.
Very good. There's somebody sitting in a room with a glass window that says they're connecting to audio, but have been for about the last quarter of an hour.
That's intended for Peter Middlemiss when he comes in, but I don't think he's in yet.
Okay, I think given that there's no sort of lay submitter folk in the room, we can dispense with the normal spiel we give about how the hearings run, other than to repeat the fact that we've read the information that's been pre-circulated. That's very helpful. It's very thorough, and we're really anticipating everybody sticking to, you know, a 10-minute or thereabout highlights package with a real emphasis on what the problems are that need to be addressed, and in particular how the individual person believes they should be. And if we could ask folk that while they're not speaking, as everybody has done, if they could just turn their video and microphone off, just to preserve the bandwidth on the rest of the call, please. So I think Mr. Middlemiss might have arrived. If you're there, Mr. Middlemiss, would you mind just turning your video on for a moment and your sound?
Sorry, I just went and turned off the camera and audio on the Middlemiss side, but he's not here yet, no.
Oh, he's not there. Okay, all right. Well, I think we'll press on, and as is normal practice, we'll start with the presentation of the officer's report, or the Section 42A report. Mr. Cleese, please.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So obviously this topic is a little bit different from the other rezoning hearings that we've had recently, in that it addresses themes rather than specific geographic areas. So as I sort of set out in my opening statement, it's been a bit of an iterative process where we started off with Dr. Davies' framework report. I also did an initial 42-hour report, you recall, looking at the concept of first a future urban zone, a fuzz, and then secondly the concept of a medium density residential zone, and agreed at that point that I thought there were merit in both zones as being available to submitters and to the panel as part of the sort of the zoning toolbox for the district. Submitters then responded, put forward a rule package, and in the case of Kainga Ora, certainly put forward a medium density rule package. I then responded to that in a second report that looked in more detail at both the Kainga Ora rule package and responded to that, and also looked at submissions seeking the fuzz and other topics that are more thematic in nature. So my part 2 report, I called it, has three sections really. One is sort of themes that aren't geographically based, and that related to sort of things like capacity. Are we achieving the NBS? Sort of fairly discrete topics around what's Kiwi Rail's rail corridor zoned, that sort of thing. So that was the first sort of bundle of thematic issues. Second topic was the future urban zone, and with the future urban zone, there was general support in submitter evidence for the concept that there was merit in having that tool available. And also got to say, there was very little submissions on the content, the policy and rules that I put forward in my first report. I think there was only one submitter in evidence who sought changes to those. So generally strong support for the concept. The evidence that we've seen over the last few weeks in relation to the fuzz is really more about where that zone geographically lands. So submitters either seeking a fuzz for their block or saying we'd rather have a live zone than a fuzz. So there appears to be very little debate around the merit of the zone and the provisions in that zone. And then the last topic was the medium density residential zone. Again, as I said in my opening statement, have worked sort of iteratively with Kainga Ora and their team over the last few months on those provisions, on the outcomes we're seeking. And Kainga Ora, I have to say, have engaged in a very sort of constructive manner, so that where we're at now is a very sort of narrow, I think, area of disagreement around a few of the built form rules. We're in agreement on the outcomes we're trying to achieve with the zone, the objective policy framework, the general criteria that I think Cameron Wallace used to identify the zone boundaries, and you'll have heard varying views about the specifics of those boundaries through the different township hearings. And the rule package, which again, we're largely in agreement on. There's just a handful of sort of built form rules where we have a remaining difference of view. So whilst in these hearings you tend to focus on the differences and the outstanding matters, I don't want that to distract from the fact that actually there's been a large body of agreement between myself and the submitters on that. So with those last handfuls of built form rules, it really comes down to firstly, how confident are you in relying on a qualitative urban design kind of catch-all rule for more than 3 units to resolve design issues, where those issues are permitted through the built form rules. And then secondly, for developments that are 3 units or less, and or developments where you're not confident that an urban design rule can has sufficient teeth, I guess, to sort of leverage significant change, whether those rules strike an appropriate balance between enablement and medium density outcomes that we're looking for, but also maintaining an adequate level of amenity for both and neighbours, where that amenity is pitched at a medium density context rather than a suburban context. So I'm certainly not suggesting for a minute that we're trying to maintain a suburban level of amenity along internal boundaries. I think that kind of is in conflict with the zoning concept, where we're anticipating change. The NPS UD anticipates change in these environments. So I recommended a very discrete sort of bundle of interconnected rules. One is about having balconies at upper level setback 4 metres. The second rule is around requiring ground level space to be at least 50% bedrooms or habitable rooms rather than just garaging, and that's to avoid the ground level being completely dominated by garaging and asphalt. And then the third one is where you do have habitable space on the ground floor, you have a ground level courtyard as well. And that's both to enable a reasonable level of amenity for future occupants, and also to drive a little bit more separation between buildings and boundaries. And look, in my view, the only typology these rules prevent or limit is a typology where you just have garages and car parking on the ground floor and nothing else. And to be frank, I don't think that's a typology we particularly want to see. But if there are particularly innovative solutions out there or sites where that lend themselves to that, then there's a restricted discretionary pathway available to applicants to demonstrate that the effects are acceptable. So in my view, the package that I'm putting forward better achieves the policy outcomes we're looking for within the medium necessary zone. Obviously, Kaingaroa have a different view on that, and that's in their evidence. So I think for the with this topic, proceed on the basis that certainly strong support for the concept, strong support for the outcomes we're trying to achieve, some fairly narrow points of difference that both parties have sort of explained in evidence, and that's where we're at. So happy to take questions on any of those topics.
Thanks, Mr. Cleese. I think what would be helpful, just to get everybody's mind focused on those areas of disagreement, if you were able to bring them up and just highlight for us the specific rules and the various iterations of them, or the various scenarios that we're talking about here.
Yes. So I'm here's some IT issues today. So I'm actually on my mobile phone rather than on my laptop. So
if you point me to what you want, where whatever it is you want to
yes,
whatever you want to show, I can do that from here.
Look, probably if we go to the rules, so I'll point you to the text changes is perhaps the easiest.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Which document do you want me to open those from?
If you open the Part 2 42I report, so that's the 16th of April report, and then you go to page 32.
Point number 9.
Yeah, it's on page 32.
I've got that here. Let me put that on the screen, and then you tell me what you want to say from there.
And it should have a rule about outdoor living courts.
Yes, it does.
Yep. So so there's the outdoor living court rule, and then beneath that there's a new rule that I'm proposing about ground floor internal habitable space.
Yes.
So those two rules work together. They dovetail. With the ground floor rule aim to avoid development outcomes where it's only garaging and car parking at ground floor, and that's partly because those sort of developments are pretty bleak at ground level, and secondly tend to have garaging on ground floor within 2 levels of residential above that form in a long terrace, and can lead to sort of very little overlooking or very little sort of separation rather from neighbours, because they only need to have a balcony rather than an outdoor courtyard. So the ground floor rule, I guess, sort of forces to a certain extent a proportion of bedrooms and living rooms onto the ground level, which makes for a much more pleasant pedestrian experience. And secondly, dovetails with the rule above, which requires a courtyard to be provided for developments that have a ground floor habitable space. And that has a benefit both for occupants, that they get a courtyard rather than being reliant purely on a single balcony for their outdoor living, and secondly sort of typically forces buildings a bit further away from the boundary. So on a typical site, you'll have the driveway running along the south side, the buildings on a terrace in the middle, and then the courtyard's on the north side. And then if the orientation's flipped around to east-west, again, you have driveways on either the east or the west, and courtyards on the other side. But either which way, you get the building mass focused back into the centre of the site with separation on both sides. And that works fine for individual detached townhouses. It works fine for sort of short terraces. And in my view, it also works fine for if you did get, say, 3 stories of horizontally stacked apartments. We have a apartment on each level, that at least half the ground floor is ground level apartments with courtyards. So it's partly about on-site amenity, and it's partly about getting a better built mass, I guess, in terms of how that impacts on neighbours. So that's really the two key rules. So it's quite a narrow area of disagreement, but in my view has some quite important implications for site layout. And then in that Part 2 report, there was an appendix at the end that had some sort of graphics showing modelling. I think it was either appendix, might have been appendix 3, I think.
I think it's appendix 2, I think. I'll let...
Oh, it might be. It's sort of got
appendix 2. I can. Do you want me to bring that up?
Yeah, yes, that would be helpful. There we go. So again, this just worked through sort of testing the rule packages put forward by Kāinga Ora, and then at the end, it had some examples of the rule or the outcomes that might result with these changes that I sort of sought or recommended. So as you can see in this example, we do get sort of, so this is permitted. There's no urban design rule because it's three or fewer units, and in my view, you can get very sort of very little separation between developments. And if you go down to the next page, it just shows that example. And this is with balcony. This was originally with balconies that were only a metre off the boundary. Kāinga Ora has since reflected on that and agreed to a greater balcony setback. But this just showed the sort of interface you get just with a typical existing sort of suburban dwelling next door. And if you keep on going down, I won't dwell on these. Again, it's just sort of some different perspectives of sort of how close together things can get. And if you keep on going down, maybe to the last page. Yes, if you just scroll through these, they're fairly self-explanatory. Sorry, one up. There we go. And so this sort of illustrates, I guess, the outcome that the rule package that I'm recommending achieves, where you have got some habitable space on the ground level. You do have a courtyard, and then that just gives everything a bit more breathing space. Still, if you were that residential neighbour, that existing house on the left, you'll obviously notice a change in amenity, a change in outlook. The bungalow that was next door to you is gone. It's been replaced by a row of 4 two-storey houses. Clearly, there's going to be a change in amenity, but that change, I think, is anticipated in the NPSUD. It's inherent with the intensification of urban areas and with the need to provide housing choice in a range of typologies. But in my view, that's not there is still a need to balance that out with acceptable amenity outcomes that are appropriate for a medium density environment.
That's very helpful. Thanks very much, Mr. Cleese. Let's see if there's any questions for you. Can we start with you, Mr. Marg, please?
No, thank you, Mr. Cleese, but I have no questions, thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, just a comment. I think, and I'd like your thoughts on it, that the Kiwi psyche is to have grass under their feet, basically. And so what you're saying in your opinion is, I believe that having an outdoor courtyard drives people away from the need to solely have outdoor area on a balcony, and therefore that becomes issues in a number of different areas. I'm hearing that correctly?
Yes, it's a two-part outcome, I guess, we're trying to achieve. One is not having just a balcony. Balconies can be appropriate in environments, but I think in a Waikato context, especially where the rule package was quite large, multi-bedroom dwellings, a single sort of 6 or 8 metre balcony, in my view, isn't sufficient to meet needs, or certainly not for larger units. Whereas I think a courtyard provides that amenity, and it also does sort of help to push the building mass back from the internal boundaries as well, so everything has a bit more separation.
Yeah, thank you. No, I have no questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton?
Yes, not on urban design, but on fuzz. You're happy to take questions on that now?
Absolutely, yep. I am.
Okay. To zone an area, a fuzz zone, what I have read and reading your report, it's got to be absolutely most likely that it will be the next block to be developed within that urban area or whatever. I know you've quoted east of Pocono, there's an area there that's applied for fuzz, and it's quite a large area that's quite flat, very, very easy to develop. That's the sort of area that is the area that would be easy to zone fuzz because it's the most likely thing to happen. But some of the places that have been expecting fuzz have been areas that have been probably maybe wishful thinking in many respects, from my view. Is that right? Just reading what what the requirements are for a fuzz, it needs to be pretty well assured that it is going to be the next part of the development. Have I got that understanding right?
Yes, yeah, I think that's fair. Certainly, in my view, sort of future urban design should be applied where you are confident that urbanisation is appropriate. So that typically would be if it was an area that ideally had been identified in Future Proof or Waikato 2070. But if it was outside those documents, and certainly the NPS chapter policy 8 rather does anticipate that you might get the odd out of sequence development, it still has to sort of logically connect to an urban area and potentially result in a good quality urban environment. So yes, I don't see the fuzz tool as being a sort of something that you just apply a bit pie in the sky to enable sort of further investigation. I think you have to be confident that the land in principle is suitable for urbanisation. It's just that either infrastructure hasn't been timetabled, or there's no structure plan in place, or there's a bit more need for site-specific investigations on, geotech, or you're not sure whether it's, residential or industrial, for instance, but you are confident that it does logically, it is a logical urban pathway for the township in question.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. So leading on from Commissioner Fulton, so with fuzz, did I read somewhere that you needed to genuinely believe or know that infrastructure was available within 10 years, or do you not really think you need a time frame around that?
It doesn't necessarily have to be 10 years, but it shouldn't be, completely beyond the bounds of sort of the medium term. Well, I guess so in terms of the NPS, it's medium term 3 to 10 years. So ideally, yes, it is something that is serviceable within a 10-year time frame. I think you probably could push it out a bit, and it's a little bit sort of elastic. But I wouldn't be identifying areas where you're not going to be servicing for sort of 20 or 30 years, because in my mind that's too longer horizon.
Yeah, and probably 10 years in my head was to do with the long-term plan and capital work program. But and on to the medium density. I can't recall, I mean, you didn't in the summary, but I can't recall in your documents. Have you talked much about impervious services? Because, I was thinking, I mean, someone mentioned, I think Commissioner Sedgwick, about grass under your feet. I'm thinking in a practical perspective where we need to have good drainage, and if we don't have good stormwater drains, we're just going to have a massive problem. So if there's grass in the plans somewhere, even if it's a small courtyard, that's going to help with the drainage. So did you talk much about that? Because I can't recall what I...
No. So look, I haven't talked, you're quite correct. I didn't talk much about that. There is, in the assessment matters for medium density, there is a line item, I guess, around adequacy of servicing. Look, because medium density generally applies to existing urban areas, it is going to be a sort of an infill situation that happens over time. So unlike a big greenfield subdivision where the developers can put in a new stormwater basin, that's not the case with medium density, where it's going to be a sort of site by site. So in my view, the stormwater reticulation is going to have to be a council-led network. I don't think you can rely on or want to see stormwater being dealt with on site, because it just doesn't work with a medium density context. So there is an obligation with intensification of these areas that council may have to upgrade some of its stormwater networks and indeed other water networks to cope with increased demand.
Yes, that's a little concerning, isn't it? Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. Oh, sorry, I was just saying, council can of course take development contributions to help pay for that. And it's that sort of situation where you kind of build up a pot gradually, and then that lets you, do any works required.
Yes, and that my concern was that most of this medium density predicted for existing towns where we're already having issues underground with the water pipes and things. So I was thinking what other alternatives are there to mitigate that, and that's why I thought grass and, you know, water being soaking into the earth as opposed to down a stormwater pipe. But just balancing the fact that we have very old infrastructure in our towns, and this is where that's going to make a bigger problem, I would have thought.
Well,
So,
it's certainly having a proportion of the site landscape does help. And look, if there are areas where infrastructure is a particular constraint, I know certainly in parts of Christchurch where we have exactly that, you know, stormwater network is at capacity, and townhouses do have to provide on-site roof water tanks that can either be reused as sort of grey water, or if nothing else, sort of hold back the flood or the rain peaks. And then release into the network slowly. So there are solutions. It is a little bit clunky. I think putting big tanks on individual sites isn't a great solution, but it is a solution. So there are options out there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gibb. Ms. Te Aho.
Kia ora. Would you say that what you're proposing, or your what you're proposing in contrast to what Kāinga Ora is proposing in those areas of contention, is more of a transition into what we think is going to happen in the future, which is more intensive styles of housing, and that in this district, in the Waikato district, there's still an expectation, as one of the other commissioners said, that they do still want a little bit of privacy and that patch of grass and a bit more space. So do you think that that's the approach that you've taken, as a more kind of transitional approach to what's going to become probably more intensified as these urban centres grow?
Yeah, look, I think that's fair. I have been particularly mindful that, you know, sort of Huntly isn't South Auckland, or, you know, so there is going to be a transitional tension there, where all these townships are all, you know, they're just suburban. There aren't really any high, you know, medium density housing at all, and that's one of the weaknesses in some respects, because there isn't that choice of housing. If you just want a small, low maintenance house that isn't that expensive, that choice isn't really available. So one of the big strengths of the medium density zone is that it does provide that housing choice. But in doing so, it creates change, and it's how you manage that change. And again, there's a tension between not sort of shooting too low and kind of losing the potential for capacity by being too restrictive, but likewise not being so enabling that the first few developments really stand out horribly and generate a really adverse community reaction against it. So I guess my real pack is trying to strike more of a middle ground there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Kearney.
Yes, I had prepared some questions, but a lot of them have been answered. So just excuse me if I might be a little bit repetitive, but I think it's we're focusing on an important point. Just generally, your approach has been to promote the enablement of medium density to help Kāinga Ora to fulfil its mandate to provide to meet housing capacity demand, and provide hopefully low-cost housing and through different typologies, I think, but at the same time to ensure that there are good amenity outcomes. That's the sort of general thrust of your approach?
Yeah. And look, and it's not just Kāinga Ora either. I mean, it's sort of, you know, we've had evidence and support from Hamilton City, Waikato Regional Council, NZTA have been supportive. You know, the MPSUD, I think for a tier 1 council like Waikato, is directing towards intensification as a tool for enabling capacity and housing choice. So it's not just a Kāinga Ora approach, albeit that they have been sort of perhaps the lead submitter on this topic. It's certainly, I think there's a wider direction there as well.
Okay. Okay, yeah, thank you. The NPSUD, and this seems to be sort of inferred in some of the evidence from Kaingaroa that the NPSUD does say that there can be, through more intense development, a change in amenity values, and therefore that seems to give some sort of license to promote mass-built housing and I'm probably being a bit harsh here, at the expense of amenity values. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I think the NPS certainly, you're quite correct, sort of recognises that amenity will change. And I think, but it's not a free-for-all in my view. So it's not saying it can change significantly for the worse. I think all the NPS is saying is, look, with intensification, you end up with a different type of amenity, and you can still have very high amenity, on, you know, in a greenfield context, places like Hobsonville, which admittedly have been sort of master planned, they're not an infill situation, but I think, you know, provide a very high level of amenity, but they're medium density. So, but it's a different sort of amenity to suburbia, and from what I read, that's really all the NPS is saying, is it's just an acknowledgement that amenity will change, but it's not saying you can disregard amenity outcomes. It's simply that the medium density high amenity a little bit different to suburban high amenity.
So you're looking at the amenity in the more general neighbourhood may change, but there should be a design amenity standards.
Yes, it's certainly not a free for all, and I think that's where we've been working with Kaingaroa to make sure it's saying, look, you know, you've got a suburban house, you've got a suburban neighbour, the bungalow next door goes, it gets replaced with sort of 3 or 4 townhouses that are 2-storey, your amenity will change. You will have more bedrooms overlooking your backyard, but that you didn't have before. But is that level of amenity actually appropriate in a medium density environment? Or is it really not appropriate and you've got, you know, balconies a couple of metres off your boundary and there's no privacy at all, and it's just an unpleasant sort of area to live. So
yeah. Okay. Okay, and has that reinforced the need to maintain a good amenity outcome? Is that seems to be, in your view, to be reinforced by the locality that we're living in down in the Waikato as compared to the mass built in the cities?
Well, I think it's partly your starting point, where in the larger metro urban areas, you know, they've already had sort of 30-40 years of experience with infill or apartment building intensification. So, you know, they're just bigger urban areas, so your expectation is different. Whereas Waikato to date is you know, small to medium-sized towns that are very suburban. Now, obviously, over the next 20 or 30 years, that will change. Those towns will grow, they will intensify. So they will change, but it's I guess all I'm saying is sort of what medium density, in my view, looks like in the middle of Huntly is probably a bit different to what it looks like in the middle of Grey Lynn or you know, Mount Eden or Ponsonby or somewhere, in terms of sort of scale and the context and the history to date.
Yeah. Okay. Just looking at my notes here. Can we pull up that modelling material we showed at the beginning?
Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah.
I think. Might be a moment.
Yeah, that's it. And if we look at that and just briefly scroll down just to give us a conceptual view, there's that one there and there's another one further down, that type of thing, which is overlooking and privacy issues, and which all goes to amenity values, and there's that one there. And you've sort of touched on the answer to my question, but I'll ask it again. With the amendments you propose, do they prevent that type of development?
They moderate it, I think. So you'll still be able to do 2-story or 3-story townhouses in a terrace. They just force, well, a sort of, lean towards that the building mass shifting more into the middle of the site. So you have driveways down one side, typically courtyards on the other, and they avoid sort of the typology that's just car parks on the ground floor with two stacked above. So there's still certainly a change for neighbours. There's no getting away from that. So if you compare the sheet that was sort of two above, with the so kind of like the backyard perspective, with the one that's at the end of the.
Can we show that?
So if you just pop up, Chair, just next slide up, I think it is, or next sheet. Yeah. So that one. So we've got balcony only, which means recession planes are the only tool that's sort of forcing mass away from the boundaries. You end up with a lot of overlooking, feeling very close, and you sort of hold that perhaps that top right hand image in your mind there of the backyard, and then you scroll down to the second to last page. Which is my rules. If you're still sitting on the backyard in that house, you've still got balconies, you've still got bedrooms that will be overlooking, but there's also there's a sense that they're not right on your fence. That there is a bit of space there. There is a bit of room to get a tree up, or your medium-sized tree in the interim. So it's still very much enabling a medium density outcome, and I've been very mindful of not wanting to sort of create a medium density zone and then have rules that completely sort of frustrate the purpose of that zone and the capacity outcomes that we're trying to achieve. I think it is a zone of change, but it's also hopefully one where those outcomes are balanced and fair, I guess, to existing residents as well. Okay.
So if I move on from that question and pose another one, do the standards proposed by Kāinga Ora, and that's the difference between you and Mr. Wallace, do they allow for the sort of development that we've seen above, that you've been critical of?
Yeah, well, the Kāinga Ora rules do, yes. So those above images were modelled off their rules. So
yeah, to be fair to Kāinga Ora, they've agreed to the 4-metre balcony, haven't they?
They have, and again, for sort of developments that have more than 3 units, so sort of 4 or more, there is an urban design rule too. So arguably, you could try and moderate some of those outcomes through that consent process. It's just, I know in practice, it's challenging for consent planners where you have a design that fully complies with all the built form standards to kind of leverage significant revisions to site layout on a qualitative urban design rule.
There's no certainty there.
No.
With the discretion, there's nothing. It could depends on the decision maker, doesn't it? Often, and the arguments put forward.
Yes, to be fair, it as does often with any consents, but it's very difficult for council planners to say, I think this is a really poor outcome when the built form rules permit and enable that outcome.
Yeah, I think you explained that in your evidence. Just on this point, I see that there's no limit on the minimum site size, and I can understand that. you can provide 35 square metre studios or 45 square metre one or more bedrooms. Is that an issue in itself in terms of amenity? Are those areas reasonable in your view?
For floor area, minimum floor areas.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. They're pretty standard. Those dimensions are in the Auckland plan. They're in the Christchurch plan. They're obviously at this, they're minimum, so they're at the smallest end. But no, I think a well-designed 45 square metre studio or whatever it is, 70 square metre 1 or 2 bedroom unit is adequate.
Okay. Where does all this design criteria go when the NPSUD says you don't have to have parking? Have you discussed that with Kaingora?
Well, there's no requirement for parking. Obviously, in the NPSUD, so saying district plans shouldn't require car parking, but of course you are still allowed to provide car parking if you want. And so the qualitative urban design rule does include assessment matters around the location of garaging and car parking, so you don't have it visually dominating the streetscape primarily. So it is a matter that can be assessed for 4 or more units.
Okay. Just moving on to the rules themselves, and I was actually working off your most recent amendments, which were attached to your rebuttal evidence, I think.
Yeah.
Can we throw those up?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. Hang on, I just got to find them on my screen. Just a moment.
Yes, and that is a fair point actually. That the recommended rules did evolve from between my part 2. Then Kaingora came back with rebuttal on that, and then I responded in my rebuttal.
So they're the ones we should be working off.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Where are we going, Mr. Kearney? Where do you want me to?
Oh, if you can go right down to 16A.3.8 outdoor living court. If you go right down.
Yeah. There.
Yeah. That's what I've got. Yeah. Now, thanks for that. So how does Rule 4 work? When you say there's a requirement, there will be because it works. Sorry, it works in with the rules, the 16A.3.9A. They've almost got to be read together, do they? Because you say on the one hand there is a requirement for a habitable area downstairs, down on the ground floor.
Yep.
But that rule on its own, as it stands, seems to provide alternatives.
Yeah, well, I think it's the difference between habitable space and principal living area. So if you've got a habitable space, which could be a bedroom on the ground floor, then you need to have a courtyard outside. But if the main living area is up on the first floor, then you also need to have a balcony off that living area. So there is an outdoor living area option, I guess, off the main internal living area. And conversely, if you just had an apartment that's wholly contained on the second floor, then you only need a balcony because 3 doesn't apply.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yes.
But then how does that link with the other rule further down? That's the
this one.
Yeah.
Yes. So the internal habitable space rule across a development requires at least half the ground floor to be bedrooms or living areas. So if you have a bedroom or living area ground floor, you have to have a courtyard. if it's just a bedroom and your main living area was up on the first floor, you'd also need to have a balcony. But if your ground floor was the kitchen and lounge, then you just need a courtyard and no balcony. Does that make sense?
I'm struggling with it because I think your evidence says does your evidence go so far as to say that there will always be a requirement for an outdoor living court in medium density? No, you only need an outdoor living court where you have a ground floor habitable space. So across a complex, you may well have some units that don't have a ground floor habitable space. If you imagine a sort of a terrace, where some of them have just got garaging on the ground floor, some of them under my rules have got garaging plus a bedroom, say, on ground floor. But the ones that will have a courtyard, the ones that just have garaging won't. So there's that sort of flexibility there. But in practice, I imagine most developments will be and at least initially, will be two-story townhouses that will have a garage and some living on the ground floor, and therefore they will all have courtyards as well. Okay. I think I can follow it. Yeah, on the basis that 16A.3.9 that says garages shall occupy less than 50%. So you got the rest of the ground floor to provide the habitable living area.
Yes.
And then does that in itself drive the need for the
courtyard,
outdoor living court?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. Hey, just another point, and thanks for that. Just on the future urban zone, you were asked about, does infrastructure have to be provided? Within 10 years, and I think you didn't agree with that. You said no, it's just got to be, it's got to be sort of planned for, but it doesn't have to be within 10 years. Is the test really the likelihood of in the end, the test is the likelihood of that area being provided with services over whatever period of time?
Yeah, I think so. It's. I guess what I'm really sort of saying is I'd be cautious about resigning something to a fuzz if there was kind of definitely no plausibility that it could be serviced for a long period of time. But where you've got an area that is next to a town, it's logical that it will be serviced. It's not in the LTP at the moment, but there's no reason why it couldn't be over the next 10 or 15 years. Then I think you could do that as a fuzz. Yeah. Okay. I think that's me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cleese. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cleese. I've just got two, I think. The first one is, could you just clarify for me or confirm for me that other than the proposed different height limits for the medium density residential zone that you're proposing apply in Raglan, where there's, I think, 7.5 metres as opposed to 11 in the balance of the areas. Is that the only site-specific difference between the medium density zone across the district?
Yes.
And I thought that was the case. And the follow-up question to that is, and it's possibly a matter more for Mr. Wallace, but you made the point that, this isn't sort of Grey Lynn or South Auckland or whatever. And it seems to me, at least, that these individual towns do have sort of, they're not all the same. They're not cookie cutter towns. They've all got history. They've all got, a different pattern of growth, all those sorts of things. Are you satisfied that one size fits all model is sort of Waikato district appropriate?
I am. Look, in fairness, I haven't, done a detailed urban design, assessment of every town. So my assessment has been you know, a little bit more, well, not generic, but a bit more sort of in principle, where I think 11 metres is a pretty standard height limit for medium density zones, in my experience across urban areas, you know, just nationally, where it does allow that up to 3 stories, which I think fits comfortably with the town centre locations that these are landing in. But I haven't done individual sort of character assessments of different towns.
Okay, no, that's fine. I suppose the purpose of the question is that most of these areas are already developed and that they're not greenfields locations. And, you know, there's not much subdivision involved in a lot of these cases. It's simply a matter of using the land that's already available as it comes up. And although there's opportunities to, you know, to buy various titles and join them together, I would envisage, at least in the short term, that a lot of the mixed density zone development is likely to be at the permitted activity scale. There's not likely to be massive scope, at least in the short term, for, you know, large housing complexes of the sort that we see in, for example, Auckland. And that's why I'm really asking the question, because it really does put the pressure on the permitted activity rules if most of this sort of development is likely to be permitted.
I agree. I think most of the redevelopment we see will be on an individual site by site. Will be, you know, one bungalow on a sort of 700 square metre site going by 3 or 4 townhouses on a row type stuff. Yes, which again is why I have been kind of concerned around getting effective built form rules, because I think that qualitative urban design rule may well not kick in for quite a lot of the development that we see in Waikato, at least in the sort of short to medium term.
So the sorts of scenarios that you're painting, the ones that you said were undesirable, left to, you know, the market to maximise space, it's quite realistically possible, isn't it? Or it's not quite the right way to express it. I mean, there's a reasonable likelihood then of having these balcony scenarios overlooking, or conversely, the first person in the street to do their development effectively stuffs it up for the neighbour because it's impossible to build anything that's got any amenity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that was the experience we had in Christchurch, where there was a similar sort of plan change that went in the late 90s, and that resulted in exactly the scenario where you had individual sites, so 800 square metre site replaced with just garaging on the ground floor, 2 stories above in a terrace with minimal outdoor living spaces, and they were really poor outcomes. And I did a plan change for the City Council back sort of pre-earthquakes, where we reviewed development that had happened and introduced an urban design control and introduced some of these sort of setback rules to fix what had been a clearly identified problem, and that's been quite successful in my view.
Okay, that's very good, Mr. Cleese. Thank you very much. That's been thoughtful as always, and panel greatly appreciates it. Thank you. That brings us to Mr. Middlemas, please.
Yes, I'm Peter Middlemas.
Morning.
Yeah, good morning. I'll just give you a brief outline. Before we prepared this document for submission, we were just looking to future-proof our lives and our land, and went through the district council rules, and they weren't that favourable towards what we had thought we might like to do. So I progressed on further and found out that the rural land in Waikato District Council is a blanket policy. So rural land covers all rural land in the Waikato District. I believe that not all land in the Waikato District is equal. For example, like there's dairy farms and there's horticulture and orchards and dry stock farms and forestry. So basically with that in mind, we had a look at our property, and with the new rules coming from central government to regional councils and so forth about fencing waterways and erosion control, there are vast parts of our property that need to be retired for that specific reason, which means the likelihood of actually generating any income off the land gets greatly reduced. So we thought, well, okay, we could do another subdivision and future-proof ourselves and the land at the same time. Unfortunately, our land mass, our residual land mass that is left would be less than 20 hectares. Well, it's not even 20 hectares to start with now. So at this present time, we are unable to do a subdivision, even though within our area, there are a lot of small blocks around us, and we're one of the bigger land masses remaining. So that's basically why we've put this document together for the council to have a look at and take into consideration some of these factors, because we won't be an isolated case. So I'm sure there will be other cases similar to this. Other bodies around in their own rights are doing land classifications, like cropping's one land classification and dairy's another, and so forth. So I'm led to believe. So I think it's about time that the Waikato District Council looked at its rural zoning and perhaps break it down into maybe 3 or more sections to facilitate the actual true value of the land and to what it's amenable to. That's basically, like, without actually rereading what's been written in the document, that's basically what it comes down to. Waikato District Council is also at the moment classifying native plantings on individual properties. And our thoughts were that if we're going to have to retire vast portions of our property, like percentage wise, we could look at, because we've already got some existing native stands there, we could look at expanding those into these areas that protect waterways and erosion, because that's going to be a growing problem for the Waikato. So I just thought I'd just keep it brief, and that's the basic outline of the proposal. Like, it goes into more depth in the document, but that's the nuts and bolts of it, basically.
Thanks, Mr. Manois. Let's see if there's any questions for you. Ms. Gibb?
No, thank you, Mr. Minimus.
Mr. Fulton?
Oh, I have no questions, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
I have no questions, but I do want to reassure you that we have read your documents in full. Thank you.
Indeed.
Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Nothing from me either. Thank you, Mr. Middlemas.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
No, and I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Manois. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. As Ms. Sedgwick said, we have asked folk, which is what you've done, to focus on the highlights package. And the fact that we haven't had any questions from you of you means that we've understood what it is you're seeking, and we now need to put that in the mix along with all the other submissions that we've received and figure out what the best overall outcome for the district is. And,
yes.
And your submission will form part of that process.
Yeah, as I've written in there, like I'm always approachable if people want to talk to me about anything, because we are contractors in the area. We have actually done a lot of fencing of waterways and so forth, and have some expertise in the field. The other thing too is we also do a lot of subdivision work as well. So don't be afraid to approach me and ask me if there's any questions further down the track or whatever.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Minois.
All right, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Ms. Trigg was due to appear this morning, but she has indicated that she no longer wishes to be heard. So that means, Mr. Allen, we're ready to hear from you for Kāinga Ora, please.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, all.
Morning.
We have, as I explained, the witnesses for Kāinga Ora around the table here, and also Brendan Leggett from Kāinga Ora himself, who is able to answer any questions should you have them of the organisation. The witnesses are John Parlane, Transport Engineer, who's got a very brief presentation because we don't think that these are particularly contentious matters, but we've got that evidence in there to cover some bases. Phil Osborne, consultant economist, again, quite brief, I would think, in terms of the presentation.
He's lodged some supplementary evidence.
Correct, so I was going to come to that.
This morning, so he'll address that.
Went in overnight, and that is, it's really just a response to some comments from Dr. Fairgrave in relation to the evidence on Raglan.
Yes.
We don't propose to take you through that in any detail at all, and we just thought we'd leave you to read that. It's a little technical in nature, and it's not really at the core of what we're wanting to talk about, but I think it's there for completeness as much as anything else. Obviously, you may have questions for him. And then we've got Cam Wallace from Barker's, who is the urban designer, and he addresses two aspects that are at the core of what we're talking about today. The first is the provisions of the medium density residential zone, which Phil Stickney also addresses in his evidence, and the second is where that zone should be applied. So Mr. Wallace's evidence then goes and looks at a series of maps that you will have seen and some advice as to why he has proposed the zoning going in certain locations and not in others. What we might do with that when we come to that part of the presentation is to have Mr. Wallace and Mr. Stickney address you perhaps collectively from this end of the table about the provisions of the MDRZ, because their evidence meshes in a way and it crosses over in a number of areas. It may be useful, and it's your call really, to have them both available to speak to questions and issues as they come up.
I think that's a good idea. We've done that yesterday as it happened on a different topic where there were sort of two aspects that were pretty complementary. So that's probably a good idea. We can hear from them both, and then ask questions of them as a group.
Yes, sir. And then we would finish with Mr. Wallace taking you through his maps and explaining why he has suggested the zoning go in certain locations, which I appreciated is pretty much the fundamental point of most of Hearing 25 for most parties, about where the zones go. But we've got a bit of work to get through before that.
Right, sounds good.
Yep. Now you have written submissions from us dated 12th of May. I have to say when we went back to them, I didn't even remember writing them, but I'm sure we did.
I would have thought Ms. Devine might have written them for you.
We work together on these things. I don't propose to take you through that. I know you will have read it.
We have.
There are a couple of things I think, and I've already explained the key aspects of what we're going to do, which is what I've summarised in 2.6, which is to explain the revised MDRZ provisions and to then discuss the revised spatial extent of that zone. 2.5, I think, is worth just repeating. Mr. Cleese did touch upon this. As you'll recall, we've had some hearings before you in the past, and through that process, we talked about the policy basis, I guess, for the MDRZ, and that fed into the filing in November 2020 with the panel and forwarding on to submitters of some draft materials and draft provisions. In response to further thinking from us, some discussions with council officers and feedback from some parties, those provisions were refined, and the evidence that you have reflects that refined position. And again, the statements of Mr. Stickney, Mr. Wallace in particular, address how those refinements are reflected. I think the important thing to note, and I touch upon it in the section on scope, is that in every case, we've been very conservative. We are not pushing the boundaries or pushing the boat out any further than we have. In every case, we're reducing, we're bringing boundaries back if we are changing them at all. So that's been a very conscious part of the decision making. There are places where, on reflection, we think, well, perhaps we didn't go far enough first time, but we just haven't gone there because we don't want to encounter any scope issues. And we're comfortable that the provisions that we have, the zoning locations that we are proposing, are supportable and appropriate. You might be able to go a bit further in a perfect situation, but we're not going to push those scope issues any further. Part of that material, of course, was a very comprehensive 32AA report, and you'll be pleased to know I can take you through that either. But there's a lot of material that was filed and Kāinga Ora wanted to ensure that it had addressed in sufficient detail the planning rationale for the provisions it was proposing and the planning rationale for the application on the ground of those provisions. Now, I just touch on that scope matter in 2.7 to 2.10. I don't think I need to talk about much in terms of sections 31, 32 or 32AA. I'm conscious that the NPS UD 2020, I understand, has been discussed obviously this morning, but also in a couple of other hearings through the earlier parts of this hearing. One of those issues that came up this morning was the discussion about effectively policy 6B, I think it is, the amenity issue. And if I can just remind you that policy 6 says when making planning decisions that affect urban environments, decision makers have particular regard to the following matters. And B is that the planned urban built form and those RMA planning documents may involve significant changes to an area, and those changes may detract from amenity values appreciated by some people, but improve amenity values appreciated by other people, communities and future generations, including by providing increased and varied housing densities and types, and are not of themselves an adverse effect. Obviously, there's an assessment to be made as to how those improvements and perceived detractions from amenity fit together and how they work. I think the important thing about 6B2 is that there's no presumption that just because you're changing circumstances, that must necessarily be adverse. The second thing is that in 6B1, there's a recognition that when we are intensifying, and after all, that's what this document, the NPS UD, is telling councils to do in much of the country, and including in Waikato. When we're intensifying, that will change people's perception of amenity. And the quarter-acre section that was part of our psyche, I suppose, for decades, is something that is gradually through the country and at different rates, ceasing to be the one typology, if you like, that people assume is where New Zealanders live. And obviously in cities like Auckland and Christchurch, that's had to change faster, Auckland most noticeably. The NPS UD is, I suppose, telling a range of other places around the country that it's coming to you too. And the comment I would make in that regard is that amenity has a number of aspects. There's the amenity that we perceive as pedestrians or drivers through an urban area. And that is the spacing of dwellings and the availability of open space and how everything fits together. And we've become very used to what is the normal language of that. And if those of us who remember the first time we went overseas and saw cities where people live differently and thinking, well, that's just very odd for the first week or so, and then that sort of seems logical thereafter. We are a country that is gradually becoming aware of those options and are becoming more familiar with them, and I think hopefully better at doing them. That's obviously part of the discussion we're going to be having today. But those amenity values change as our perceptions of what we're used to change. So this NPS, these planning provisions will change amenities, perceptions of amenity, but it will also, the implementation of it over time, change people's perception of what is good amenity or what is the amenity they're comfortable with. The second thing I would say about that is that amenity values, in terms of what Kāinga Ora is trying to do, also in a sense involve, for individuals, are they in a warm, comfortable, accessible, usable place to live? Do they have a place to live at some levels in terms of the difficulties we've had in terms of housing New Zealanders? So this document does, the NPS does raise challenges for councils and for communities. And in a sense, the planning response is easier than the community response, because it's only when people become used to different amenities that they become possibly able to appreciate the benefits of them and what they bring to them. The other point I would make, and I think this is a question that Commissioner Cooney had raised through the hearings, is with respect to, find it, and I think, sir, it was really subpart 1 and part 3 of the NPS, where we're talking about providing sufficient development capacity for housing. So that's, in terms of housing, that's policy 3.2. And there's been some discussion that we're aware of as to whether the supply to meet demand should happen in the location where the demand is. In other words, is it a regional or a district response? And a council can say, I'm going to add supply in this location to deal with the district demand, or is it more nuanced than that? And if I take you to policy 3.2, 1, it says every tier 1, 2, and 3 local authority must provide at least sufficient development capacity in its region or district to meet expected demand for housing in existing and new urban areas, and for both standalone dwellings and attached dwellings, and in the short term, medium term, and long term. Now, if we look just at in its regional district, you might think that gives councils an ability to provide capacity in Raglan to deal with demand in Pokeno, or something along those lines, or the reverse of it. I think that what the policy does is it creates a new obligation on councils. It doesn't remove the need to plan rationally and to logically relate demand and supply, because in practice, of course, creating supply in Raglan doesn't respond to issues in terms of people wanting to live in Pokeno or Tuakau. And if you look at A, we're talking about meeting expected demand for housing in existing and new urban areas. That's starting to give us a little bit of a focus. You might say that just means in existing places wherever they are, and in some new places wherever they are, and you don't necessarily have to have them in places where demand is present. But I think overriding all this are the issues that come through in the RMA, which of course remain there, which tell us that you're only meeting expected demand if you are meeting it in the location where the demand exists. And where you have a region or a district, there will be very different demand conditions at either end of those districts or regions. And for the council to do its job appropriately in terms of the RMA as well as in terms of this NPS, in my submission, it does have to have regard to the parts of the district, the urban areas, if you like, existing and proposed new ones, where there is particularly high demand, and try to match that as well as it can. And it can identify the areas where in fact there isn't much demand. So there may well be hinterland areas of any district where there really isn't a lot of demand occurring there. And it's not an answer to the NPS to say, well, I've zoned land in this small rural town and that solves my issue and I don't need to zone land in the places where demand exists. So I think that was an issue that had come up during the course of the hearing.
If I may on that, Mr. Allen, otherwise I'll forget. But I probably tend to agree with you on that when you start to look at it. My view is I think the NPS does seem to say, well, your district has got to meet, got to have sufficient capacity. But when you look at the housing assessments that you need to be done, those directions do say you've got to look at each sort of area and work it out. And so when you follow that through, you will see where the demands are in those particular areas. And so therefore that then translates into, well, you can't just ignore where that demand is, even though overall you've got to provide the capacity in the district. So you still got to focus on that. And I think that's where you sort of finish up.
Look, I would agree, and I was going to take you next to 3.6, which is the housing bottom lines for tier 1 and tier 2 urban environments. The purpose of the housing bottom lines required is to clearly state the amount of development capacity that is sufficient to meet expected housing demand, plus the appropriate competitive margin in the region and each constituent district. So that, yes, you need the margin, and you need to be regionally and district-wide appropriate, but then it goes on and says in Roman in 2, for each tier 1 or tier 2 urban environment, as soon as practicable, make publicly available the relevant regional council and territorial authority bottom line. So I think that's starting to direct us towards particular urban environments. And whilst Ngaruawahia has some connectivity to Hamilton, and Tuakau has some connectivity, you might say, to Pukekohe and then beyond that, the reality is Raglan and Tuakau have nothing connected. They are not part of the same urban environment, if I can put it that way. So I think the focus starts to come much more directly and explicitly on particular areas and getting a response to it. And combined with that general overriding RMA rationale, if you like, or the provisions in there, I think you end up saying, I've just got to look at where the demand is and match capacity as best as I can. I might move it around between Tuakau and Pocono, might contribute in slightly different ways to resolving a northern Waikato issue. And you might have some decisions at that level as to where you put it and a real flexibility, but you can't answer that by going down to it, I suppose.
Yeah, okay.
Again, I won't take you through the bulk of these submissions. I will just comment briefly on 4.4 and 4.5. We are aware that some submitters have sought to apply the MDRZ to areas other than around the town centres. So you recall that the MDRZ zone designed by Kāinga Ora and its consultants focused on in creating increased density around particularly the commercial centres and other particular nodes. Some people have come in and said, well, we might be able to have that on the periphery of town in certain circumstances. We're leaving that to those people to argue. We're simply, and we've put in evidence that simply supports the relief that we're seeking and the form of development that we're proposing and the location of it. Others obviously can try and run further with those provisions, but we are not involved in that discussion and we haven't tried to think about it in any depth. We've had enough to do on our own. I then cover in the submissions the outstanding matters. You've heard from Mr. Cleese the nature of the matters that are still, and the relatively minor nature of the matters that are still at or in discussion, and points of difference between him and Mr. Wallace and Mr. Stickney. I'm going to leave it to them to address those matters, and they have a lot more knowledge and a lot more familiarity with it. At part 5 of the
spent far too long doing this kind of thing. So generally you want to just try and
sorry,
sounds like air traffic controls interrupted us. Not quite sure what that is.
I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, I think so. We can hear you okay.
Part 5 of the submission just deals with the basis upon which the proposed spatial application of the MDRZ was determined. Again, I'm much better to leave that to Mr. Wallace, who did all the work on that and answer any questions in a lot more detail. And then point 6 deals with a number of matters that came in through the various 42A reports. I don't propose to take up a lot of time. One of the issues that's come through, and look, it's totally understandable, is that some of the we unusually perhaps have had to look at all 42A reports on all districts, on all townships, because we're involved in almost all of them. What we've noticed there is that there are some issues where some 42A reports take a particular position, others take a different position. We've explained what position we think should be adopted, and obviously it would be desirable, I think, for a consistent approach to be taken through the district, and clearly, sir, that's the task for the panel to determine how best to do this. I don't think any of these are particularly dramatic and need particular comment. I might just touch briefly on the one about land adjacent to town centres, which is 6.5 through to 6.8. The reporting planners for Raglan and Pocono both propose to retain a general residential zoning for land surrounding the town centres to provide for the possibility of that land being required in future for commercial zoning to allow for expansion. Effectively, they're saying, well, let's keep it at a down-zoned residential because we might one day want to use it for commercial. The problem with that, I think, is that you will get reinvestment in this area over time. and that reinvestment can't be shifted because it might have a design life of 50 or 70 years. If we know we're going to need more space in the future, let's zone it. We think that the commercial centre needs to be bigger, then that's something that should happen, if it can, through the relief sought at this point, through this process. If it can't, because there's no relief available to you, then the council might want to initiate a plan change to do that. Otherwise, if we're not prepared to zone it commercial, then my suggestion is, and our submission is, it should be zoned MDRZ because that's the more appropriate residential zoning for that area. Otherwise, we're relying on some decision in the future saying, well, we might like to expand our commercial zoning, but we haven't figured out yet how much and where and whether we even need it. So that we think is quite important because that does directly affect our zonings. And again, sir, in 6.14, we have the MDRZ height limit and zone extent in Raglan. That has touched upon the evidence, and if you have questions on that, I'll leave that to that discussion. Those, sir, well, that's my summary, if you like, of the submissions. If you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Allen. We may or may not have any questions, and we may prefer to wait until after we've heard from the witnesses and see if there's any roundup issues, but let's see if there are any questions at this point. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, Mr. Allen. It's pretty simple and clear about what you've provided. Thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
Not at the moment, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
I'll hold my questions, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have none at this stage, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
No, thanks.
Mr. Kearney?
And you just one, Mr. Allen, just going back to your paragraph 3.8 there, where you referred to the urban environment question.
Yes.
There, because we've received a lot of evidence in different hearings saying, well, this is only a small town, it doesn't qualify as an urban environment because it doesn't have 10,000 people, etc., etc. Under your point 3.8, you could extend that argument to almost all the smaller towns around because of their locality or location between Auckland and Hamilton.
I think to some extent, yes, and that may be reflective of the, may be reflected in the fact that Waikato district is identified in the NPS, not just Hamilton and Auckland. And this is the most intensive corridor, I think, between centres, major cities in New Zealand. And the NPS is telling us it's going to become more so. And clearly, logic tells us it's going to become more so. We've got a motorway now, finally, that connects us. We have rail that connects us, albeit slowly. To me, I think in the future, it is only going to become a stronger connection between Hamilton and Auckland, and those townships in between will serve a function and will be, the people who live there will have a connection to Auckland and or South Auckland and Hamilton, particularly, that means that they are part of that wider housing and labour market. And I think it is really important to note that the urban environment definition is not a town that does certain things. It is any area of land, regardless of size and irrespective of local authority or statistical boundaries. So immediately you're accepting Pocono, for example, could have a connection with Auckland, which in reality it does, of course. That A is or is intended to be predominantly urban in character. Well, these townships are urban in character. The farmland in between, no. And there'll be some villages that don't really qualify as urban, but certainly places like Huntly and Ngarawahia and Pocono and Tokau do. And B is or is intended to be part of not a town, but a housing and labour market of at least 10,000 people. That's a pretty broad description. And if you have a fair proportion of your people who live in Pocono, who travel north to Auckland or South Auckland in particular, and I suppose we've got the Stevenson's land that's also zoned and would be opened up over time for employment. If they're working in that market, then that fits within this definition. And that I think is clearly the intent, because it would have been easy to draft a definition that just talked about a town. having 10,000 people, but it's a much broader and intentionally so.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with that. Your arguments there. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Mr. Allen. I don't have any questions at this point either, so thank you very much. I think
Yeah.
we're not far off our morning tea break, but let's deal with Mr. Parlane.
Right. Well, I will move to the left, and Mr. Parlane will move to his right.
Give way to your right. Morning, Mr. Parlane.
Good morning, sir.
Just when you're ready, thank you.
Okay, well, my name's John Parlane. I'm a traffic engineer and transportation planner. I've prepared a statement of evidence and a summary statement that was pre-circulated, and I understand you don't want us to read anything out from the stuff that's already been submitted. So really, I'm in your hands. I don't have anything new to present to you. I have read some of the other statements of other transport people, and I've got no real comments to make on any of them. So if you have questions about what I've done, I'll be happy to answer.
Well, let's see if we have. I mean, your summary statement's short, sharp, and sweet. It's sort of a page and a paragraph, which and we've read that, and we've read your prior evidence. But we'll see if there are any questions for you or not. Could we start with you, please, Ms. Tiaho?
No, thank you. I don't have any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Gibb?
Just one question about Raglan, actually, and the fact that with medium density housing, we're presuming people will walk, to most of the services. But Raglan also doesn't have a very good public transport system. So do you see that as a totally different? I know you said that it stands out on its own as a coastal town, but it is different to the other towns in our district that have good public transport systems and lots of employment opportunities. So can you expand a bit on that?
Yes, it is different to the others, as I've noted, and that's partly because it isn't as much of a commuter town as some of the others, although there is commuting to Hamilton long distance, and I think that will continue to occur. But Raglan, the centre is actually quite sort of compact, and I think you will see a lot of people who live in these inner areas, in the inner part where the zone would be applied, will walk to the shops, they'll walk to cafes, to the library and those sorts of activities. And also walk to, you can walk across the footbridge, there's places to go. For particularly if you're retiring to Raglan, and a lot of people go there for retirement, you might still choose to own a car so that you can get to Hamilton under your own steam when you wish to. But I think even in Raglan, the medium density zone will help to reduce the use of private transport because it means that you have more people living closer to the centre. So our goal is to reduce that trip rate by private car. And I think that zone will still be applicable here in Raglan and will still work.
And presumably there are less likely to be people that are employed in jobs because if they decide to stay in Raglan, there's less opportunity for work there than there is in other towns, I guess so.
That's been the case, but change is happening, I think, and technology is the big unknown. 3 years ago, we wouldn't have been having hearings using this sort of technology, and you'll find, I think, more people looking to relocate to somewhere like Raglan and work from home. And I think that the data I've given you, none of it's based on computer models. It's all statistical data from the census. And I think that the big change that we'll see from the next census is more working at home and less use of private car through that, with people using Teams and Zoom. From my own perspective, I used to come into Auckland for meetings every week, many times. I was in this office at least once a week and sometimes twice a week. And this is the first time I've been in here for probably 2 months. All the other meetings we have are by Zoom and by Teams, and I could quite happily move to Raglan and do most of my business from there.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Fulton.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mr. Marlane. Thank you.
Ms. Cedric.
I'm just interested, please, in your journey to work data. When was that taken from the census? Is that what you were referring to?
Yes, it is. It's a data set called Commuter View, which is collected. It's been collected and put together in that form for the last 3 censuses, but it's only in the last one that it's really been online in a really easily usable form.
And was that 2017 or 2020 figures?
It's 2018.
18. Okay. So so things will have changed quite significantly in some areas where there has been growth. And I'm just picking up on Ms. Gibbs' comment in terms of Raglan. And I'm interested in the data that's come through for Pokeno and Tuakau in particular, but also in Te Kaupata, where it says 50% of employees residing in Te Kaupata work in Te Kaupata. And I'm wondering if the fact that the major employer is a retirement village has unnecessarily skewed that data because there's no industry. I just wondered how confident are you of this information? And
okay. Firstly, it's factual information because it is collected at the census. When in the past we would have used computer models, which are also based on census data, but usually the previous census, not the most current one, because it takes time to build a model and to validate it. So by using census data directly, we're 5 years ahead, in effect. Secondly, I don't make any assumptions in putting this together, whereas with models, they all include the analyst's assumption or the assumption of the person who actually built the model originally. And those assumptions can be relevant at the time the model's built, but not necessarily relevant at the time you're using it. And thirdly, the data, because it's freely available, anyone can actually go onto the statistics right now and have a look at this, and you can repeat the results that I've presented. In terms of change, the big change has been, of course, the COVID and more working from home, and people, either not able to travel to work because of lockdowns or taking advantage of the technology that we now have to not do that. So I think, if anything, the trip rate has dropped since this date has happened. The thing that we don't know, and I can't advise you on, is how resilient that will be, if that's how things will continue to be for the next 10 years, or whether we'll change back and go back to the old days of sitting in front of each other at meetings.
Thank you. And your point on COVID is where I was looking at as well. Thank you very much. I have no more questions.
Thank you. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Mr. Cooney?
No, thank you.
And I don't have any questions either. Thank you, Mr. Parlay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that's probably a good time to break for morning tea, Mr. Allen. So we'll do that and we'll resume again just a little after 10 to 10. Let's say 11. Let's say 5 to 11.
Thank you.
Thank you. If people could not log off though, please, and just mute their sound and so we're ready to resume. Are you there, Mr. Allen?
I am.
Not sure if he is.
He's right there.
Yes, he's just to the side of Mr. Osborne.
Oh, same room. Oh, that's...
Yes.
Same room, different chairs.
We'll call that visual mitigation that he's off camera. So, Mr. Osborne, just when you're ready, thanks. We have received that supplementary statement of yours, but haven't been able to read it other than sort of acknowledge that it's there. So, I think it's
excellent. I think
you'll need to take us through, please.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, commissioners.
Morning.
My name is Philip Osborne. I'm a consultant economist for property economics. I've submitted a evidence in chief, a summary statement, and the supplementary statement last night for Kāinga Ora in support of their submission. In terms of time, I think it's important just to distill down some main points in my evidence. I think most of the position that's presented in my evidence has been supported in the 42A report that has shown that supports the medium density zone as improving affordability, choice, and improving economic efficiency. I've outlined at the start of my evidence some of those economic benefits to medium density, but the evidence itself is really revolves around whether that capacity, a feasible capacity, can actually be obtained through this zoning. As such, the assessment of feasible capacity has shown that the medium density zone will produce approximately 2,000 more feasible dwellings than the notified plan. It will produce this product at a price point that is 25% less than those that are likely to be produced under the notified plan. An important aspect of that assessment is that this is the 2,000 additional feasible development capacity is not just one typology. This has been, our feasible development has been reconciled against demand by settlement. So in each settlement, we've looked at the revealed preference of demand, whether that's standalone, terraced housing, walk-ups, things like that. And we've actually reconciled the feasible capacity with that. So it's still, as my evidence shows, it still shows that 77% of product that is going to be produced under this is going to be, in terms of growth, is going to be standalone product. So this particular submission is not in these areas forcing everybody into a particular property type. In fact, the majority of the feasible development is still feasible for standalone and, in fact, larger houses. As I say, the 42A report has supported the economic efficiency of this. In terms of the supplementary evidence that was produced, it addresses a few concerns raised by Dr. Fairgray in his evidence in reply. He's raised some concerns around the term high level. In terms of that, I was simply talking about the way that I had described the model rather than the model itself for feasibility being high level. Our modelling for feasibility is done at a site-specific level. It takes the attributes of specific sites in terms of their land costs, the existing dwellings, age of dwellings, all that sort of data, and actually works out whether a site will be feasible for both infill development and comprehensive redevelopment. So it's quite a specific type of assessment. So those concerns are not really valid in terms of his direction. The second concern he had was around the demand for typology. He was referring specifically to Raglan in regard to this. As I've alluded to, the one of the key aspects of our modelling is to actually reconcile that with demand. So in the Raglan settlement, what we've done is we've looked at the current structure or the revealed preference for particular types of housing. We've looked at the household structure that has been projected to be resident in that area in the next 30 years. And we've looked at their demand preferences or their propensity to purchase and live in particular styles of houses. And that's how we've reconciled that feasible capacity in Raglan and, in fact, all the settlements throughout Waikato. Finally, in terms of that statement overall, the concerns raised in Mr. Fairgray's statement as it pertains to the property economics model appear to be based on the lack of understanding of the level of detail involved in the modelling that has been undertaken, stemming from the misreading of my statement saying it was a high-level assessment as opposed to it being a high-level outline of my approach. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Osborne. We'll see if there are any questions for you. Can we start with you, please, Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions. Thank you, Mr. Osborne.
Ms. Gibb?
Nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Sedgwick?
Mr. Osborne, I think it was your evidence, and please correct me if it was not, talking about the zoning of school sites. Was that, have I got that as you, or is it better addressed to somebody else?
That wasn't part of my evidence, no.
Okay,
In terms of school zoning.
Then my arrow goes the wrong way. My apologies.
Thank you. Ms. Tiaho?
I'm not sure if this question is meant for you, but in his legal submission, in the legal submissions we heard earlier, we heard that, you know, we're becoming aware and more familiar with intensified housing opportunities and options, but there's a realization that we need to do this better than perhaps what's been done overseas. And the second point that was made that I wanted to raise to get your feedback on is that it would only be meeting demand if these intensive models are built in areas where demand exists. So in terms of that first point that was made, do you think that what's being proposed is doing things better in a Waikato district context, and that we're not just kind of transporting a generic model into this district?
I think that's probably a question better placed for Mr. Stickney, yes,
okay,
and Mr. Wallace.
Right.
And,
what about the demand issue? Is there really going to be demand in, say, places like Huntly, Ongaruawahia for the kind of apartment style model?
No, I appreciate the question. I think it's important to look at what our modelling actually considers. It considers two key factors of that driving of demand. One of those factors is the household, what currently exists in terms of the household structure and what currently exists in that market for demand. But also it looks at the affordability. And an important factor in people's demand and people's revealed demand is what they're actually able to afford. And I think it's important when we consider that and consider whether people have a willingness to accept this product, we have to consider whether they can actually afford that product. So demand, just simply from a semantics point of view and from an economic point of view, is a willingness and ability to actually purchase that product. And I think it's that ability that we're looking at moving forward to produce a product that people can actually afford and can actually own, that becomes economically efficient. I think as you produce more of that product, as we see around the world and in New Zealand, some of the amenity gains and the economic efficiency and agglomeration gains that result from that type of product actually start to perpetuate the demand for that product. As you get greater density in an area, you get greater amenity, you get greater provision of types of retail and more diverse retail and more diverse access to jobs. And that actually perpetuates the demand itself. So to answer that question, I think that when we're looking at a 30-year time frame, there really is the ability for some of these settlements to actually provide a material level of medium density product anyway that the market will in fact accept.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mark?
Just one question or point of clarity, Mr. Osborne, around 2.8 in relationship to feasible 25% lower than required under the notified zone. Can you just elaborate a bit more around that affordability?
So the affordability, the way that results is essentially we ran both the notified, we ran the operative, the notified and the submission in terms of that feasibility. The result from the notified was essentially larger land lots, and that's where a lot of your affordability comes from, because you've got even though per square metre on a smaller lot the land's more valuable, the nominal value of that site is considerably less. So a lot of that saving, the difference between I think 700,000 under the notified for an average developed dwelling and 550 under the submission. A lot of that difference was because you were essentially using less land per dwelling.
Right. Economies of scale.
Economies of scale and efficiency, land efficiency. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kearney.
Just at a high level, and we've had a lot of figures put through to us over all the hearings. Just to recap, what is the need in the district for housing over the medium and long term? What in your assessment?
It depends on which one you look at. We've got we've got an assessment, and I mean, I think as we were probably, as the commissioners were made aware in Raglan, some of the work that has been done by council up until this point hadn't included unoccupied dwellings. So there isn't actually a number before us yet that includes things that potentially are missing from that assessment. But we're looking at about, I think, 25,000. Originally, it was 19,500 under the original HBA, and it's about 25,000, I think, total dwellings now, according to the new 2020 Waikato University assessment.
Okay. And what does the proposed plan as notified provide?
That's a good question. In terms of that, there's no comprehensive assessment of that out as yet. The operative.
I think Mr. Davey tried to have a go at it.
He had to go over the short to medium term, and I think he showed that there was just enough for that period of time. So essentially, what his assessment would show that in the longer period of time there would actually be a deficit or a shortfall under the plan. There was about 6,800, I believe, in the original HBA, but again, neither of those numbers include unoccupied or holiday homes and things like that. Yeah. So the deficit would be larger over that period of time.
And you're providing a further 2,000 homes under your medium density proposal.
Within the medium density zone, there is at least an additional 2,000. We're actually providing, the submission provides for considerably more than that, but because we've reconciled it against demand, we're not suggesting that there's 20,000 feasible apartments within the zone and suggesting that that is realisable. So essentially, we've tried to reconcile that feasible capacity with demand and said, well, what is likely to be wanted in the market? We're not going to force everybody into apartments and say that there is feasible capacity.
So you've taken into account a realisation factor.
Yes, we've taken into account the preferences of the market and what they would actually want to live in.
And okay, thanks for that. Yeah, that's me. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I don't have any questions. Thanks, Mr. Osborne. That's all pretty clear to me. Thank you very much for your evidence.
Sorry.
I think now we've got a tag team act, haven't we, between Mr. Wallace and Mr.
I'll invite Mr. Wallace and Mr. Lee, and we'll come through.
Thank you.
And hopefully it's
Morning, gentlemen. Just when you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and panel members.
Morning.
My name is Phil Stickney, Technical Director at PECA in a planning role, and I've been working with Kaingaora over the last year and a half or so on this medium density housing matter, amongst others. Just what I thought I'd do is just give you a very quick rundown, an overview on just a couple of the processes that we've worked through very collaboratively, I have to acknowledge, with Jonathan Cleese, and also facilitated very helpfully by Carolyn Ratt in terms of developing these provisions. And that's been a process that has led us to where we are today, albeit we have two areas of disagreement or divergence in relation to the provision of outdoor living courts and the habitable space garage ratio under the permitted activity scenario, and I'll come back to that. The second work stream obviously has been working closely with Cam Wallace at Barkers and members of the Kaingaora team, and also with council to assist and observe in terms of the ground truthing of the extent of the zonings sought for the key settlements of interest to Kaingaora, and Cam will pick up on that after I've it might say. I think in a nutshell, firstly, unless there'll be some questions possibly, but in terms of the discussions with Mr. Allen about the NPSUD, I concur fully with the responses from Mr. Allen in respect of that document. In particular, I think just highlighting the adjacency of Auckland and Hamilton to the Waikato district and the influence of those areas in terms of employment on the Waikato. And speaking as a North Waikato resident myself, I can certainly attest to first-hand knowledge of that relationship as I sit here in Auckland today. What the intent has been with the medium density zone, just in terms of, I guess, setting the scene, is effectively, with the guidance afforded by the NPSUD in particular, it's effectively the zoning moves the permitted baseline from one house to three, from the general residential zone. And that's the starting point. From that, we've developed the rules and objectives and policies framework, which clearly we've worked with council on that and made adjustments and changes, and we're in agreement on the objectives and policies we have in front of us. We've also sought a zone statement, which just provides additional context in terms of interpretation, notwithstanding it's not a formal part of the plan per se, and I think that sets the scene very well for the zoning. There's some other thoughts or considerations we've had as we've moved forward too with developing the rules, and that's been largely because we've had the benefit of the involvement of property economics as well, and Kāinga Ora and their experience as we've developed the rules. And at the back of our minds has been, are we looking at a long-term proposition in terms of the zoning and the standards that we've got, site coverage, etc., and trying to get flexibility for variant typologies that will inevitably emerge over time. Are we taking a long enough time frame in terms of, we know that the district plan is a 10-year lifespan, but we really want to try and avoid, I think, getting into the situation of being in a reactive state to changing market trends as time marches on. And I'm sure we're all familiar with that sense occasionally that the planning framework is in a reactive state on that issue. What is feasible in terms of market development, likely uptake, and Mr. Osborne has provided some evidence on that, and looking at obviously the predominant 70% of the dwellings envisaged at this stage will be freestanding as opposed to the terraced or apartment typologies. What may the market want over time? So where are we heading? So is our envelope flexibility to deal with different typologies without having to rewrite the rule book? And finally, in terms of that relating to affordability, does adding a rule in a particular case add cost, forcing to regulate or achieve a certain level of amenity, where the actual benefit on the overall amenity of that zone is not really realised in the context of the additional cost that rule might add? And by that, I'm thinking envisaging things like setbacks in buildings at first floor level, etc. So those have been perhaps some underlying thoughts and drivers for Kāinga Ora and the team as we've developed these provisions. I would also point out, just in terms of the assessment criteria, which are set out, we've worked those through with Jonathan Cleese, and there were changes agreed to those in respect of when you hit that 4-unit trigger, in respect of design, scale, character. Outdoor living courts is now woven into those assessment criteria. The provision of 3 waters infrastructure, and also the issue of where on-site car parking is provided, the design and location of car parking, including garaging viewed from the streets or public open spaces. So I've gone through those in the context of what's been discussed today with Mr. Cleese, and I remain comfortable that certainly the assessment criteria for 4 or more units deal with adequately with some of the issues he's raised in the context of the 3-unit scenario, and Mr. Wallace will talk a little bit more about that. Mr. Allen's picked up, I think 2 on Pocono and Raglan in terms of some of the zoning, extent of zoning and the recommendations in those reports, and I'm happy to answer any questions on that. And yes, I also, in my rebuttal evidence, and Mr. Wallace has talked about it, just the underlying zoning for schools. And we have addressed that, and we're happy to take any questions on that. So I think that if that's sufficient for you, Mr. Chairman, by way of a quick overview, I might pass over to Mr. Wallace, if you're comfortable.
Very good. That's fine. Thank you, Mr. Wallace.
Good morning, and the rest of the panel. I guess again reiterating Mr. Gleeson and Mr. Sydney's points around, we did work together collaboratively through kind of these refinements, and there really is just a couple minor sticking points really around that ground floor habitable space / garaging, and the essentially now the requirement that all units must provide ground floor outdoor living courts. As I've kind of set out in my rebuttal evidence, I have a number of concerns around these in terms of the practicalities, in terms of my experience, apologies I've been seeing coming forward around the country in similar zones. I haven't been seeing the issues that Mr. Cleese is kind of seeking to resolve through his amendments. And I think there's just some inconsistencies which were kind of discussed earlier that I think Mr. Kearney was raising in terms of how those changes to the development control should now be read. You know, in my mind, essentially it requires all dwellings now require habitable space at ground floor, which therefore means all dwellings require an outdoor living court at ground floor. So that's a kind of a significant change to what we were proposing, I believe, and a significant reduction in kind of flexibility to be able to respond to specific site circumstances. And I guess at a broader picture, when we're talking about amenity, it's been discussed before, amenity is very subjective, and some people may value a grassed backyard, but equally some people value proximity to cafes. Some people value actually having on-site parking and garaging as being an important amenity. So when we're talking about amenity, I think we need to be conscious of a single professional with no children has very different housing needs than a family of 4. And so when we're trying to set these levels, I think we just need to be very careful that we're not mandating a certain type of living arrangement for something that may be entirely inappropriate for segments of the community.
Doesn't it make a difference as to whether you're the occupant of the dwelling concerned, in which case what you say is logical, or the neighbour of such a property?
Yes. So there's that kind of full scale. There's kind of the urban scale amenity issues, and we're talking about streetscapes, just general appearance of building forms. For the neighbour, they're concerned about things like privacy and shading and overlooking primarily. And then, when you're on site and you're living in it, you have certain needs and requirements that are going to be different than what your neighbour wants. So this is the kind of challenge with amenity. There's all these kind of you have these different scales, and what people value in terms of amenity, they may be in conflict with one another. So that's really the kind of the challenge in this process, is trying to mediate those conflicts to get an acceptable solution.
Just sorry to add to that, I think. Oh, sorry.
Mr. Wallace, what about the argument that you're promoting low-cost housing to help people? They're desperate to get into a house. And so they're prepared to forego a level of amenity just to get into the house. And then over time, because of the low quality amenity, it has an impact on them in terms of their social issues and things like that. Isn't that something we can take into account?
Yes, but I guess it comes down to the subjective position on what we consider to be low amenity, low quality. And there's a much broader issue in terms of if people are desperate to get into housing, it's a supply issue. So if we're enabling more supply to come online, in theory, they should have more product and choice to be able to choose from that suits their particular needs.
But that's pushing amenity standards right down, isn't it? With that thrust to provide housing at all costs.
No, I mean, I'd submit there are still some baseline standards that, although crude, set the baselines in terms of this context. Firstly, as I said before, we are dealing with this scenario primarily in the context of a 3-unit permitted scenario. I believe that there is sufficient teeth in the assessment criteria that a competent planner assessing an application for more of those where you have some of these non-compliances has got sufficient scope in the wording of the assessment criteria to certainly challenge the applicant in terms of the quality of what is being produced, and certainly in a cumulative sense, when you're 4+, you're up to 6 units, then there is sufficient teeth in there. You still have those baseline standards with your 30% permeable surface and your 45% built form coverage that set that basic envelope up. I think it's more a case about how that is within that envelope. What I'm concerned about is we seem to be introducing almost another subset of permitted activity standards, which will have the effect of watering down on those smaller sites the ability to achieve good density and good outcomes without having to go through a resource consent process for that particular issue. And I think so it's just how far down are we drilling into that permitted scenario with those basic frameworks around it. Are we, at the risk of sounding blunt, are we taxing ourselves unduly on the issue of amenity in the context of those overall standards for a 3-unit development in this case? And that's where I'm comfortable.
Okay, thanks for that. So that's the sort of issue that's between Kāinga Ora and Mr. Cleese's approach. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for that. Sorry, Mr. Chair, butted in there.
That's all right. Is that all you guys both wanted to say? Or
Mr. Allen was just referring to the proposed changes from Mr. Cleese around the requirement for 50% habitable space at ground floor, and whether it's worth talking about that in a bit more detail, because it is quite a large change to what we had proposed. So in my kind of rebuttal evidence, I set that out in kind of sections 2.9 to 2.15. There are a number of kind of common scenarios which I come across where I think it would preclude a bunch of common typologies. I don't agree with Mr. Cleese that it only precludes a typology which is simply garaging at ground floor level and everything on above. It's quite common to see typologies where you might have a rear lane type development where you have a garage tucked in behind and a ground floor study or bedroom at front. And in cases like that, you would see the garage or non-habitable space occupying considerably more than 50% of the ground floor area, but equally as viewed from the street in terms of the general public amenity and perceptions of the development, it would look no different than a terrace housing product which provided no garage. So, and similarly, I don't necessarily think it resolves the issue he raises. In terms of the control, you could still provide a row of garaging at ground floor level and you could have all your habitable space loaded behind it. So you would, in theory, go down an access way, which is just purely viewed as garaging and or front doors with no habitable spaces outlooking onto that. So I believe it's kind of best considered it kind of in the round in terms of that overall assessment for more than 3 units, where you can kind of consider all those contextual factors in the site in terms of the overall quality of the development and how it's responded to site-specific circumstances.
I think also Mr. Wallace to add to that. Mr. Wallace and I did, obviously, when we were doing some ground truthing, and then Mr. Wallace has looked at titles, taking an sample sort of land parcel within some of these settlements, and just obviously looking at the historic surveying pattern and layout, and goes without saying that the vast majority of these, if they are attached units, would be facing at 90. The garages would be at 90 degrees to the street. And there's restrictions on vehicle crossings, etc., that you can have. So, in that sense, from a visual amenity perspective, and I'm not going to overstep the bounds into landscape architecture and visual assessments, but at the end of the day, that viewing catchment for that particular site would be limited, and also bearing in mind again that we're in the realm of a permitted three unit scenario.
Okay, that's the end of your presentation. We'll see if there's any questions. Can we start with you, please, Ms. Cedric?
Yes, I'm interested in a couple of points and unclear as to why you've amended some of the zone extents. And I note that topiary has been in the evidence has been excluded, and I understand that is obviously because of the higher order policy. But it does. I guess I'm trying to think of how up to date are we getting, and the job of what we have here is to think forward, not to think what is now. We have to think of what could be and enable that. So the comments that were made regarding topiary were, lack of commercial space, etc., and yet to the innocent bystander, it appears that it has grown of its own accord in any case. And firstly, so that's my question. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, so I mean, we covered it off briefly. I don't disagree that we should be forward-looking, but when we're forward-looking, we have to be considering the kind of changes to wider infrastructure provision, not just horizontal infrastructure, but community facilities as well going in the area. There isn't, as far as I could tell based on the proposed revisions, any meaningful or significant expansion of that kind of commercial area in the core of Taupiri. It has the single school, so it is a lot more limited than the other settlements, albeit in close proximity. I think there seem to be a few wider unresolved issues with Taupiri around cultural issues, heritage issues as well, which hadn't been fully resolved yet. And in my opinion, that would be kind of best all kind of handled together once we have kind of more surety about those wider issues.
All right. And in relation to Te Kauwhata, there is no mention made in your report, and probably quite rightly so, of the 1,300 kāinga ora houses already there. What would your comment be on increase, and where you have increased also the zone? Could this be turning into kāinga ora light, if you like?
Yeah, sorry.
Are you all passing the buck there?
We've seemed to have moved a bit from the provisions to the zonings to policy. So,
sorry, I might have to get that question again. I was at the other end of the table. It's quite hard to hear.
Thanks, Mr. Liggett.
My question was relating to the information that I'm reading, to the increased zone in Te Kauwhata, to the exclusion of other towns, if you like. But now with the announcement of the 1,300 homes that are being built in Te Kauwhata, how do you balance that up?
I guess in terms of where we're at with this current process, the 1,300 homes are developed based on what's already gone through a process. Fundamentally, it's an existing package of plan changes and consents that have been picked up by Kāinga Ora to roll out the development of. So in terms of the planning framework here, yes, the rezoning may subtly change that going forward in line with what we consider to be a good urban response for Te Kauwhata going forward. And some of the land, albeit a very small part of the land, would feature. But in terms of the 1300, that is in line with all of the former planning that, as we understand it, at least Waikato District Council has done for that township. And we're simply coming in to finish off the master planning exercise and assist with the delivery of it.
So my question then, from a visual, from a social, from an amenity perspective, as a township, what would be the implications of far more intensive development with a Kāinga Ora overlay, if you like, on it, coupled with the fact that the 1,300 houses more than tripled the number of houses existing in the village. So it's looking like, what I'm saying is, it's looking like becoming a very Kāinga Ora centric town. Is that your understanding of it?
Not in terms of final form by any stretch of the imagination. I think our role in Te Kōwhara is to act as a delivery partner in the delivery of those homes. We will not be controlling 1,300 homes out the other end of that delivery. In fact, one of the questions that is at large and still unresolved inside our organisation is how many ultimately do we want to own out the other end? It would not be a very large proportion. If we look at Waikato region as a whole, and when we talk Waikato from our perspective, that includes Waikato District, Hamilton, South Waikato, Matamata, Piako. We're talking about 1,000 roughly in terms of what Ministry of Housing and Urban Development wants for increased social housing provision. About 980 houses over the next 3 years. You know, if we're looking to deliver 1,300 homes in just Te Kōwhara, we only need 980 across that entire geography. And if we put Waikato District into proportion, it's 10% of what we consider to be Waikato, because we've got Hamilton City itself has to feature there, and that is a dominant player in that new supply. So in terms of what we're forecasting of that, sorry, there's a lot of numbers coming at you. It's somewhere between 90 and 100 homes is what we would expect to be delivering in Waikato District over the next 3 years. Out of that total 980 that Ministry of Housing and Urban Development are looking for. So 1,300 does not go into 90 or 100 very well. So that development outcome for Te Kōwhara is certainly not a public housing outcome. It is a housing supply outcome to meet additional housing need that exists in that corridor.
All right. Now I haven't, just my final question, and I'm not sure who this relates to, but it's a comment that was taken suggesting that the information from the Auckland Unitary Plan to zone schools in accordance with their surrounding sites, the comment being that Kāinga Ora says that the Waikato Council should be adopting this philosophy. I'm not sure if that's relating to you or if somebody else wants to do the hot chair dance.
Well, there's probably a couple of answers, and I can give you a Kāinga Ora flavour, and then our wider team can give you their professional advice as well. But from Kāinga Ora's perspective, we have a lot of conversations with Ministry of Education about their land, their footprint, how it should be used, and looking at how schools are provided. There is mechanisms, at least in the public school provision, to use designations. If you're using the designation to supply the school, what is the appropriate underlying land use zoning? Should that designation ever be altered to have a residential zoning sitting underneath it, consistent with its balance of the urban environment, if that's what's surrounding it, makes sense from our perspective, particularly in circumstances where we are often one of the first agencies to consider the appropriateness of a different use other than school. And there are a number of examples around the country where we are the purchaser of that balanced land where it's not needed.
So most of the schools in the Waikato District, presumably in the urban areas, would be in urban residential areas, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah. So I'm looking at, again in Te Kōwhara, at a little slice of land, which is directly behind the town centre. And and questioning if it's in the middle of a commercial development and there is limited commercial development to be had, would it be logical to retain that as residential?
Could you, so I'm looking at the map of Te Kauwhara.
Yeah.
Could you just clarify the location that you're talking about? Sorry.
We both need to be probably looking at the same map. I'm looking at the map on page 187 of Mr. Stickney's planning report of the 17th of February.
Okay, we're just going to bring it up on screen and share it. Sorry, bear with me one moment. How do we share on? Okay, can we all see that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great.
So if you go to the town centre, which is in the light blue, and you see the main street running basically from the bottom to the top up towards a business zone section.
This area.
I can't see your cursor.
You can't see the
That's it, sorry, no, I can see it. Yeah. Okay. So if you just come directly down from where you are, you'll see there's a long line of town centre on the right hand side of that road, and below that is where the school is. So my question is, that seems to me, I understand what you're saying about towns, being, they should be developed close to town centres. In this instance here, as I know well, there is a minimal town centre. So my question to you is it reasonable to expect that to be residential, medium density residential, or given the oversupply of land in Te Kauwhara, would you consider that might be more useful as commercial?
The school side is commercial.
No, it's not. The underlying school zone is residential.
Well, I think in terms of the approach to Te Kauwhara, we have been slightly different. So we've got a much smaller extent of medium density residential proposed, based on the fact that it is a smaller centre and there is kind of less proximity to general services within the town centre itself, as well as kind of the larger settlements north and south. In general, in terms of our position, we think that everything around these town centres is appropriate and capable of accommodating medium density residential.
I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that for a growing town that is quite a small town centre, and notwithstanding the area to the left on the map above the part we were looking at, it is quite a small developed town centre with minimal opportunities to expand. And so my question was, my question or comment was, how would you help a town to expand if you put residential in the middle of it?
Well, I could probably from a planning perspective,
Yeah,
because it's a similar issue, or a parallel issue of Pocono as well.
Yes, exactly.
What we've got there. This is clearly, with the medium density zone, is clearly an upzoning exercise and the ability to use land in a more efficient way in the future around the commercial hub. What I don't believe has been done. And we've obviously gone and ground truth that. We've got the provisions that have been developed for this medium density zoning to give us some outputs in terms of what that will produce from a plan enabled perspective, and also, as Mr. Osborne said, from a market perspective. I'm unaware, and I know there's been projections done on business land and forward planning that council has commissioned. But I think the emphasis now really needs to go back to, in terms of the land that you have proposed to be zoned under the more notified plan review process now, is almost a seven, and I don't know whether it's been done, so Mr. Cleese or one of the team might be able to answer this. I'm not aware of any detailed assessment of those commercial areas in terms of their redevelopment potential, the ability to add more intensity through heights for or the ability to change the dynamics in terms of car parking requirements, etc., to unlock some of that existing commercial land so that it can be upcycled and used in a more intensive way. And certainly, I think in Pocono that's something that there is vacant land in Pocono or underutilised land, but the same issue applies in terms of whether that level of planning has been done for the business zone land rather than just a projection of what we think we will need in a hectare sense, versus actually the intensity of the land use and the land use pattern in the zone.
Thank you, that makes a lot of sense. I have no more questions.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Martin?
If we look,
sorry.
Douglas Allen here.
Sorry, Mr. Allen, can we just turn, I'm struggling to see because we've got that picture up. Can we get rid of the picture now, please?
Yeah. Yes, we can.
Thanks very much. Now I can see you.
Okay. On that picture, the blue area was quite large. The light blue area is quite large. If you look on the next page of Mr. Wallace's plans, you see an aerial photograph.
We might need to put it back up. I'll have to, now that you're speaking and I know who it is, let's put it back up. Sorry about that.
Here we go. I think somebody is going to try and have a go. Yep. So we can see this is the next page in the plan. The blue area on that previous map is the area between the two striped orange pieces of land, which is where the new zones to go. And probably 70% of it or 60% of it is vacant in terms of that photograph. And it may have been developed a little bit in part, but essentially the council has zoned, as we understand it, quite a lot of land in this township for a centre that is clearly bigger than it needs currently, but is logically going to be sufficient size to accommodate a larger town in the future. And the second point then is, we're not aware of council or anybody else seeking to rezone the residential land that the school is on from residential to commercial. What the Kāinga Ora submission is saying is, given it's residentially zoned, it should be zoned MDRZ rather than general. If the council thinks that the extent of blue commercial centre at Te Kowhata is going to be too little for the future, it can remedy that by zoning more land, and one site it might zone would be the school site, although practically, of course, the school site becomes available only if the school goes. And I suspect with an increasing township, that's an unlikely outcome. The other point I should make, sir, and I say this because we acted for the Ministry of Education on the Auckland Unitary Plan process. The rezoning of in the Auckland Unitary Plan, council introduced a school zone. And the ministry and the minister said, well, that doesn't help us because we have a designation for a school. We don't need a school zone. What you traditionally needed an underlying zoning for in the case of a designation was to tell you what you could do if you weren't using it for a school. So we went back to the old-fashioned thing that we used to do under the TCPA, and we've done for decades under the RMA, and we said, well, give it the zoning of the land around it so that we all know that if the land becomes available for whatever reason, this is the use that we put to. And that is the approach that I think the plan currently in Waikato has in terms of schools. And we couldn't understand the logic in having a school zone. Obviously, it is used in Auckland in the case of private schools because they don't have the designation power. But in simple terms, if the council thinks it needs more land, it can zone it. we think it already has sufficient land in Te Kowhata, which is vacant and ready for commercial purposes in the future. If it wanted to rezone the school, it could do that, but I suspect it won't practically be helpful.
Well, no, and thank you. Your response is in itself practically helpful. We have heard in previous hearings that the land that you're referring to as the extension of the commercial zone or town centre zone is in useful farmlets, if you like, or farming land. Thank you.
Right, and that's the tension between accommodating people and farming land. And the history, I guess, of Auckland and the Waikato is that ultimately where there has been a need for housing, it's tended to be reflected and ultimately in zoning. But that's clearly a matter for the landowner to take advantage of or not.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me, thanks.
Mr. Fulton?
Yeah, it appears you come as close as you can to an agreement on the design for outdoor living and so on around these medium density housing. So I'm just taking the position now that it's going to be up to the panel to actually decide which one they choose. Is this the way this is sitting with you at the moment, between you and Mr. Close?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's good. Okay. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Mr. Fulton. Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing from me, thank you.
Ms. Tiaho?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I asked earlier on whether what you're proposing is actually better than what we might have seen overseas or in different jurisdictions. And so are we actually doing more density well, as you're proposing? And the second question is, what is the cost in terms of affordability if we go with the proposal to have more living on the ground floor rather than the garages and asphalt?
Just in terms of an initial response, in terms of, are we doing things better? I mean, every jurisdiction is kind of different. What I would say is, I'm most familiar with the Auckland Unitary Plan. We are proposing, KO has proposed a set of provisions more onerous for medium intensity residential than currently exists in Auckland. In Auckland, you essentially have at least for when you go above that permitted threshold of 3, you essentially only have 3 rules to meet: height in relation to boundary and yards and building coverage. So we are providing additional requirements around some of those general amenity issues that have been raised. What we are doing is acknowledging, though, that there is, or we're seeking some flexibility, because in terms of delivering good amenity outcomes, there will be certain sections of the community who don't believe a large grass living court is a good amenity outcome for them. They may value a lower maintenance, smaller dwelling and take benefit of existing public parks, for example, and that is how they derive amenity. So what we've tried to do is kind of mediate between those two tensions and ensure there is flexibility and choice in typology. I think it's also important to recognise that within the district, we will have large areas which aren't developed. So we will have still a large amount of housing stock on large sites with large dwellings and large open spaces as an alternative to medium density residential.
I think at the back of our minds, but it's actually now embedded in the objectives and policies in the plan is the housing choice issue as well, in terms of providing for those varying typologies and in such a way that, and I think we're getting much more sophisticated and better at doing medium density development in this country. But it does provide you the ability to stay within the community that you want to stay in, but at various ages and stages in life, there's housing typologies of choice within these settlements that mean that you don't have to uproot and shift to an entirely new location. And I think that that's something that some of these settlements in the Waikato, just from my own observation, have probably lacked in part over the years.
And the issue of affordability. So how much more would it cost, say, for the product if we went with what was being proposed by the reporting officer in terms of the
I guess we haven't done detailed figures. I mean, what I can say at a general term is the revised provisions as proposed by Mr. Cleese. I think it's not unreasonable to assume that people in the Waikato would want on-site parking, and a lot of people would want garaging. So if you just take a basic idea of a single garage around 18 square meters, and then you put on a requirement for 50% habitable space at ground floor. Once you take into account things like hallways and stairs, you start essentially mandating minimum ground floor levels of around 50 meters. When you throw on a minimum requirement of 20 square meters, you're looking at kind of a core lot area of 70 meters squared at minimum. And then once you go up to a second story, if you're thinking about build costs of around 2,000, 2,300 a square meter for quite a basic finish for a terrace house typology, you start pushing up the costs. I'm just thinking if you've got say a 60 square meter dwelling, 120,000, 130,000 build costs. If you're kind of essentially mandating a solution which may drive certain typologies up to 100 square meters, then you're adding $80,000 to $100,000 onto the capital cost, at least, of the building. And then there's the general land costs. So if you're mandating more land area through outdoor living spaces, you're invariably increasing site sizes and increasing the land cost component of that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooney?
Just a general question to Mr. Leggett. How do you intend to deliver the medium density zone in terms of building the stuff?
In terms of the houses that we would construct?
Yeah. Well, what sort of approach do you get into partnership with private developers, or do you do it yourself? Or it's a general question like that.
Yeah, so there's many ways to deliver a house, and Kāinga Ora, when looking at the numbers that we need to deliver and the land that we hold, actually needs to pull all of the levers to deliver. So while we're sitting here with a presentation of a medium density zone that does cover some of our footprint land for our redevelopment purposes, where we're developing that land in our own right. We have a whole business unit set up to design and construct houses. So we will undertake the design process with consultant support, seek consents for it, obtain building consents, and then tender it to a construction company to build on our own land. Outside of that, there are many other procurement pathways. We could either purchase land in the market and follow that same process, or we could commission houses directly from existing developers within the marketplace, which is why for us, having a medium density zoning framework that works in the construct of the urban form of a city or as a town, as opposed to a medium density zone that sits on our land, which is why our submission is not a Kāinga Ora land submission. It's a submission as to how we see these settlements should be developed over time. It's because for Waikato, what we're currently projecting is that about somewhere between 50 and 55% of our new supply actually has to come off land we don't own today. So in the next 3 years, we need to work with the market to deliver the housing that we need in Waikato. Hence the nature of the submission that we've made.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Thank you.
Thanks. I've just got one question, and it's probably for Mr. Stickney, but it may be Mr. Wallace can contribute as well. Mr. Stickney, you made mention before about the objectives and policies having these aren't your words, but in relation to the question from Ms. Tiaho, you mentioned that the objectives and policies are where those urban design criteria kick in. They're not the words you used, but that's what you said, or that's the gist of what you said. I guess my question relates to the fact that those objectives and policies are pretty much irrelevant when it comes to permitted activities. And it's really the permitted activity rules where the rubber's really going to hit the road on these provisions, given that there aren't vast swathes of readily developable, brownfields areas or large lots that are able to be able to be amalgamated and whatever. So I take the point that you want flexibility, but don't the objectives and policies come in when you have something that is of that larger scale, and that we need to be pretty careful that we don't create, a very unappealing scenario whereby, yes, you might have some great flexibility for an individual property owner who wants to put 3 townhouses on a property, but makes the neighbour's development opportunities almost impossible because of the sorts of scenarios that Mr. Cleese referred us to in his presentation, where you've got 2 balconies looking out on each other and so forth. Do you have a comment on that?
I understand the issue you're raising. In response to that, yeah, look, I fully understand in terms of objectives and policies and assessment criteria, that's in the next phase of 4 units plus. So yes, we're currently looking at that 3 unit scenario. I'm of the view that when you're looking at that 3 unit scenario, and I'm guided in terms of the current site alignments, depths of site versus frontage in these settlements, that they will primarily be 3 units if attached. When they're attached at 90 degrees to the road frontage. Understand that if you are then the next cab off the rank for the adjoining property, you are going to have to do your best to work within the parameters of what has been built before you, as that's now up and built and part of the existing environment. And I fully understand that for a developer that may cause some headaches for the architect in terms of how do we structure things so that we have some, it's attractive to the market. But I think in terms of those balconies, we're now looking at quite a 4 metre setback, much further than we were before in those discussions with Mr. Cleese. So I'm comfortable that with that 4 metre setback, and if that's mirrored on the adjoining site, there's an 8 metre setback between the 2 upper level balconies. And I'm reasonably comfortable with that. Also acknowledging the height in relation to boundary concession planes that are in place as well. So I'm not, hopefully I'm answering your question, but
yeah, no, that's very helpful. Thank you.
It's not necessarily going to make it impossible to develop next door. It may create some existing environment considerations that when the design is being developed, there are some things that the neighbour has to do just to deal with that adjoining property. On the context, once again, that it's a permitted 3 unit development as opposed to the
if I could just add to that as well, section 2.4 of my rebuttal evidence, I do make some comments on the modelling. And I think when we look at this, we need to be very careful about what the plan enables and what can actually feasibly be delivered. So to get some of the results that Mr. Cleese used in the modelling requires absolute full build out to the permitted activity standards. You have to consider what the cost of that will be to build and whether that is remotely competitive with the market and with the alternatives already on offer in the market. So with larger site sizes, if you're looking to go double story again, you're adding significant amount of build cost from just a single level unit. If you're permitted activity standards in terms of the building coverage, you can still get ground floor units on your typical site of around 120 to 140 square meters, which is still quite generous for a 3-bedroom home. So I think I'm comfortable with where the provisions have landed, because whilst in theory you could see some of those results, I don't think the likelihood of that occurring is very high because of market realities and sheer build cost required to achieve that. You're increasing build cost, there is an expectation that amenity increases with the increased price of homes, and I don't think it's a particularly likely scenario in the Waikato context for that to occur.
No, that's helpful. I suppose one thing that occurs to me, this sort of whole concept of medium density is new for the Waikato district, and that's just a reality. You know, other jurisdictions are more familiar with them, and you're probably much more likely to say, well, you know, we've got a history over the last 20 years or whatever it is of these sorts of things happening. I just wonder what your view would be to the proposition that says, given that this is a one-time shot really, because once these developments happen, there's no turning back for quite, you know, virtually permanently for all practical purposes. Would that not suggest that we should take a somewhat more cautious approach to what we might do in this first generation plan regarding medium density zoning, and say it may be that in the short term you need a few more consents because we need to be a little bit more cautious than we might otherwise be, you know, if we've already got medium density zone round the corner or down the street. Do you have any comment on that, either of you?
I could start. I'd just say our approach actually has been conservative in terms of what we are seeking to enable, and compared to more mature markets where we have seen a lot of medium density housing over the last 2 decades. This is more at the this is probably still more at the suburban end of the scale in terms of medium density development in comparison to places like Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch. So I think we have kind of built that into the provisions from the outset.
My view on that issue, and look, it's an entirely valid one, is almost flip it the other way around, and that's based on the work of property economics, and Mr. Osborne spoke today about the likely mix and the percentage of development, 30% that may be attached dwellings. And given that we are taking very much an enabling approach and appreciating that this development hasn't happened in any significant way in the Waikato in the past, but we are trying to enable some capacity and encourage people to start to look at these forms of development, and acknowledging the primary development will be standalone dwellings. I think that at this point it's actually and I don't believe we've got a light touch. I think it's an appropriate balance of rules. But I would say that council, I'm sure, will be monitoring the uptake and what happens over the next, once the zoning is in place. And when there's a mature market and there's demand, then the need for yield and capacity really starts to increase. And that's where sometimes you find that things start to go a little bit, get a little bit wonky. So I think it's actually to say at this point in time, I'm comfortable that there'd be the point we're at now with the rules provisions, but I would say absolutely keep monitoring those over time in terms of what changes to the market, and bearing in mind the MPS discussions about amenity. But if it is tipping over, then I would fully endorse the council being proactive to close any loopholes that perhaps over time start to emerge. But I think to make it any more directive and prescriptive at this point in time might potentially slow down or put some inertia on what the submission is trying to achieve.
All right, no, that's helpful, thank you. All right, I don't have any further questions. Thank you very much, both of you.
Sure, at this point, we've had the discussion about the rules.
Pardon me?
We've had a discussion about the rules, but we haven't yet had our discussion about the zoning, although we did move into that.
Understood. I was just passing it back to you. You're
right. So at this point, I'm going to leave it to Mr. Wallace to take full command. And the other thing that we, some of the discussing the height control.
Mr. Chair, my screen keeps fluttering off and on. Is it just me, or is other people having a problem?
No, I don't. I'm not. I don't think.
Okay.
Might just be you.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, thank you. So in terms of the zone extents, I was not involved in the original Kāinga Ora submission. I came on subsequently to kind of review that submission, and I think it's important to note that since the submission was made, there's been some not insubstantial changes to the proposed district plan through the natural hazards chapter coming through, as well as the NPS UD coming live. So as kind of part of this wider package of works, I felt there was benefit in going back and reviewing the original KO submission in terms of the overall extent. I would point out that this review actually resulted in a reduction of around 380 hectares of proposed medium density residential zone across the district. And this was based on the kind of methodology I adopted to test each of the settlements based on a number of criteria, primarily based on accessibility to the town centre, but then also taking into consideration other issues around access to general services, amenity, topography, those types of issues. And I also, with Mr. Stickney, went around each of the settlements as well, drove around them, got out of the car, walked around particular areas which kind of stood out as potentially being contentious, or where I was unsure about the where the analysis was leading me, just to get a kind of a first-hand understanding about the kind of the lay of the land at each of the settlements to help with the refinement of each of the settlements. So I'll now bring up, I propose to just go through them north to south, Tuakau down through to Raglan, just kind of covering off some of the key issues which came up through my analysis, and kind of responding to some of those Council Section 42A submission points as well in relation to that. Yep, and fire through questions as I'm going through each of the settlements.
Okay, thank you. I think we might wait to the end, otherwise it might turn into a bit of a conversation fest. So let's you carry on, and we'll let you finish, and then if we've got any questions, we'll ask them at the end.
Can people see that?
Yes, thank you.
Right, so I'll just kind of cover off this quickly. So this is where the submission point started off at in terms of Kāinga Ora's original request. So this is just kind of going through that methodology, looking at walk catchments. So this is kind of derived on the existing road and footpath pattern. Mentioned Tuakau. Looking at kind of 400 and 800 metre walking catchments. And so you can see there's quite a big difference in when you use radial catchments. I looked at topography just to kind of get an understanding of where there might be particular issues or barriers to essentially walkability, and then just kind of looked at where you have that kind of intensity of activities and services which you require to live for kind of day-to-day uses, so things like pharmacies, schools, parks, all those types of amenities which people generally rely on to go about their daily lives. The result of that was quite a significant reduction in Tuakau. It's kind of largely focused more around a 400 metre walking catchment essentially, and taking on kind of largely the historic area. The biggest kind of issues with Tuakau is really, in my mind, the kind of western boundary here, where it just kind of, the roading pattern kind of bleeds out to that large area of residential zone land out to the west. But in general, I think the existing kind of block structure and topography and lot layout kind of formed a relatively useful and kind of coherent boundary. The school site is obviously down in this block here. That obviously benefits from being located on the main road up through to Pukekohe and having access to public transport up through to Pukekohe. It's generally flat land and still within a reasonable walking distance of the centre. So in my mind, that whole block of land still is appropriate to retain the medium density. Sorry, I'll just skip through some that we don't need to necessarily talk to. Pocono now. The original request. So obviously one of the challenges which came up through this process is reserves. A lot of reserves weren't zoned for reserves. So this kind of created some oddities in the original request. And it was only once you're kind of down on site and studying the aerials that you discovered that what looks like a nice greenfield piece of land on a cadastral plan is actually a existing reserve. So obviously pulling back on those areas which are obviously reserves under kind of council ownership or in the process of being vested towards council. The key thing for I guess for Pocono was based on the walk catchments, using the rail line as a clear logical boundary and kind of concentrating that housing in and around the town centre. And you also have some large kind of greenfield sites to the north still undeveloped. So they offer, you know, some of the best opportunities for more comprehensive development of the zone. And there's not many of those across the district. So those, especially Pocono, that's quite a key opportunity to enabling a lot more intensive comprehensive development in close proximity to the centre. We briefly also discussed, there was that wider issue we've raised in terms of the rezoning of this land in here from general residential to medium density, which was identified in Mr. Mead's report as potentially being suitable for expansion of the business zoning. I guess our position is that if it's zoned residential, it meets the criteria under our analysis and objectives and policies that it's more appropriate to be medium density residential than general residential. To Kalfata, the biggest issue I guess, and is relating to this large area of greenfield land to the south of the centre. So in general, we've just sought to realign the zone extents with street corridors just to provide a bit of a transition and buffer between the lower residential stuff. There was some discussions around this site, namely because this parcel of land to the south here was identified as a reserve in some of the notified planning maps, and subsequently we discovered that it wasn't. I put forward a number of kind of alternative configurations. I understand there's probably an issue around scope with that, but I kind of put forward my preferred position based on looking at the site again in terms of where logical road boundaries would form and topography, and that resulted in a recommendation to slightly extend this further to the south through my rebuttal evidence and evidence in chief. Moving on to Huntly. So the key issue with Huntly here is the original KO submission using that radial catchment picked up a lot of land which was actually very far away from the centre, primarily due to the fact that you only really have a single crossing of the Waikato River. So what you can see is that significantly reduces the walkable catchment to the existing town centre, but also going on a site visit, walking around Huntly West, it was noticeable that it was kind of an identifiable kind of neighbourhood community node with a lot of social services. You have the schools there, which are obviously attractive in terms of having proximate housing to be able to access primary schools, secondary schools. So in the case of Huntly, I thought there was a valid argument where we could consider the kind of Huntly West centre, although it's not really zoning that, as a appropriate area to consider further extension of that medium density residential zone. So that kind of resulted in this retaining a lot of this uplift in Huntly West. The other issue in Huntly is obviously going back to the natural hazards, and there is discussion around this site in here in particular in terms of being subject to the high risk flooding overlay. Again, this is one of those issues where we found there were inconsistencies with the Section 42A reports. The report for Narrawahia takes a different approach and interpretation. There's probably a planning matter around the use of overlays versus zones. My opinion is you kind of zone the land what you think it should be used for, and the overlay manages any of those other effects. And in the case of this site, it's of such substantial scale, I could conceivably see viable and safe kind of development occurring, particularly around the edge of that flooding area. The northern end, it's probably unlikely based on the topography, but at least around the edge, I think you could get viable housing solutions with sufficient freeboard that can be appropriately integrated into the wider parcel of land should that be developed. Ngaruawahia, so I note that the revised locations for Ngaruawahia, again, consistently we've pulled in all these boundaries based on this further analysis. The Council Section 42A report didn't disagree with any of these recommendations, I understand. They were comfortable with this extent. I did note some oddities around this southern area in terms of a kind of a more logical pattern would be including some sites which were not previously identified. But obviously there is a scope issue there, but from a kind of a pure outcomes approach rather than a process approach, I believe there would be some benefit in potentially including those sites. Just general efficiency and kind of a logical urban pattern. Raglan, so Raglan again was treated differently than those larger centres on the corridor with a much more refined, smaller 400-metre catchment, and this kind of really follows that kind of main ridgeline coming around in the kind of town centre basin. The walking analysis kind of aligns quite well with the radial catchment because it is a kind of a compact and permeable core area in Raglan. Obviously, another key feature with Raglan, and has been picked up previously, is the landform. So you do have some steep terrains, and this has had some impact on existing housing form within the centre, and would also have impact on the types of medium density residential you could deliver to address issues with that topography. And I guess in terms of that, in terms of the reduced height limit, I would note that when you go around Raglan, it's quite distinctive in terms of that landform. You have several knolls placed throughout the urban area. So what you have is kind of 2-storey houses placed on top of a knoll, which actually sit quite prominently and appear more like 3- or 4-storey buildings already there. You look around, you have a lot of homes on stilts with 2 stories on top, and you do see 3-storey buildings, especially up on the ridge lines. And the general premise here is people are looking to take advantage of those coastal views, not unreasonably, because you have northern views of the water, which provides a very high amenity environment. So my position would be the retention of that 11 metres in the first instance is appropriate and would be important in providing amenity for medium density residential within the Raglan context. Alternatively, if the 7.5 metre was to retain, I recommended the inclusion of an alternative height measurement using the average height method rather than the rolling height method. This is a method which is kind of adopted in a number of jurisdictions and is targeted at areas where you have these topographical issues, where using a rolling height method can significantly curtail feasible development in terms of, especially in terms of a medium density type of development. Also take into account coastal hazards for Raglan was another particularly important one in terms of coastal erosion or inundation. So that's resulted in an area pulling back from those high risk areas. And also looking at kind of the ridgeline in terms of where properties to the south have access, they're actually kind of, there's an obvious ridgeline through here. So there's an obvious disconnect where these properties at the south are connected, not really tied into the town centre. So I can see logic in pulling back from that area. So that was the general approach that we've taken. We've sought to take a very consistent approach in line with the requirements of the MDRZ rather than varying it by settlement. It creates, in my opinion, it creates a lot of efficiencies in the future in terms of housing delivery. There's kind of a well understood package of controls which could be rolled out across the different sites rather than creating bespoke housing designs, which invariably increase costs due to the need to engage architects to design specific very specific package of controls for each of the sites, whereas a terrace house typology is a fairly well understood typology in the market, and you can, and invariably you do, take a fairly standardized approach in terms of layouts, albeit you do vary it based on some of the site specifics. So that's really the summary of where we got to in terms of the zone extent. So happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Wallace. Can we start with you, please, Mr. Marg?
No, nothing from me. Nothing from me, thank you. That was good.
Thank you. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, that was all very, very clear. Thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions. Thank you.
Ms. Gibb?
No, nothing from me. Thank you.
Ms. Te Aho?
No, me neither. Thank you very much.
Mr. Cooney?
No, appreciate the way you presented that. Thanks very much.
No, I don't think I have any questions either. I think that's clear enough. I think the issues that we wanted to raise probably came up, or that I wanted to raise came up earlier. So thank you very much, Mr. Wallace.
Thank you.
I think we've come to the end of that presentation.
It would seem so.
It would seem so. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at some length, and for allowing us to present once rather than multiple times.
No, that's fine.
Made it a lot easier for us. And I suspect I'm the next person too.
Next and last, I think.
Yes, okay. So we move to that.
Why not?
And this is very brief.
Is that lawyers very brief, or
no, well,
chair very brief?
This entire presentation is going to take a couple of minutes at most. Tainui Group Holdings Limited made a submission suggesting that there be some urban zoning for effectively commercial industrial purposes across the where the expressway is going, at, if you like, to the east of Ruakura. I filed on the 17th of February 2020 a memorandum. So this came in well before any of the legal submissions had to be in. It was the time when the evidence was meant to be put in, just explaining where matters had got to. The essence of that was that there are discussions involving regional council, district councils, city council, Hamilton, future-proof, the whole range of entities with an interest in these matters, and they are ongoing, were ongoing then, are still ongoing now. And this is not a matter that Tainui's Group Holdings Limited has filed evidence on, and it's not a matter that we're going to press at this point. Those discussions are the most appropriate way to keep moving it. There's some rationale as to why the relief is considered appropriate. If I take you to the conclusion, paragraph 16, for the reasons set out in that document, TGH considers industrial logistics zoning of the Ruakura land would be appropriate. It would complement the Ruakura Inland Port and related logistics and industrial zonings west of the expressway. TGH's hope is that the future-proof stage 2 process will reach a conclusion in time to allow any agreed outcomes to be implemented through the PDP process. Obviously, that's not happening yet. At this stage of the PDP process, we're running out of time. While TGH is not providing detailed evidence in support of a submission, it may prove possible to use the submission-related stage to rezone the Ruakura land without an additional plan change being notified. Now, that was the, if you like, the process point made. We're not at a stage yet to be able to move on beyond that memorandum, and time is passing. I appreciate that, and you have roles to fulfill and decisions to issue, and we have not come to you with evidence, but we thought it appropriate to let all the parties, submitters, council, and other entities involved be aware of where things are up to in terms of the process we're going through, and be familiar with the rationale in simple terms as to why that was being done. So I have nothing more to add to that. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But
let's see if we do. I suspect we don't, but let's see if we do. Mr. Marg?
Just a point of clarity, Mr. Allen. Knowing that it's rural land and wanting to change ultimately to industrial for the purposes that have been outlined, what would you be wanting or seeking from us then?
Well, the intention was, I think, to get some zonings, but the reality is that as those negotiations go through, there's a regional issue.
Yes.
That logically you would follow through first. So hence the discussions involving the various councils, including the regional council. And at this point, we're not pushing the relief. It was hoped that those processes would come along, that we'd be able to move things in tandem. It's not looking like that's going to happen quite as quickly as we might have liked. But that's the rationale for being there. And as you're probably aware, along that eastern boundary of Hamilton City with Waikato District, there's an agreement in place that it has in the past and probably in the future will lead to incremental changes in the boundaries and then incremental changes in the urban area. So the logic clearly is that where we have what is in practice an extension to Hamilton City, there is a logic in Hamilton City having responsibility for that land and all the matters that flow from it in terms of infrastructure and planning policies that are consistent. Often having different councils across a boundary on the edge of a city can produce anomalies, and that's something that I think the region rightly has recognised it wants to avoid. Waikato District and Hamilton City clearly accept that, and I think the regional council understands it too.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sedgwick?
No, nothing from me. Thank you very much.
Ms. Gibb?
Nothing, thank you.
Mr. Fulton?
No, I have no questions. Thank you.
I don't think this is one that you're participating in, Ms. Tiaho, that's correct.
I was just going to say that because of my position with Te Ara Tauta, although I'm not a director on Tainui Group Holdings anymore, now that I am the chair, that I was going to declare that conflict.
Very good, thank you.
Understood.
And Mr. Cooney?
Is there a signal here that you might still come knocking on our door before we become functus officio?
I'm not going to say we're going to give that away, but I think the passage of time is making it increasingly more difficult to be able to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And I have no questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, sir. Yeah.
That brings us to an end of this particular hearing, so we'll adjourn. Thank you everybody very much for your contribution and participation. And as I say, we're adjourned. Thank you.